The moment Eleanor Whitaker's boots hit Colorado dirt, the man who was supposed to marry her turned his horse away and left her standing in the cold with nothing but a broken trunk and his final words ringing in her ears. "I ordered a wife, not a burden." The whole trading post watched. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody except a silent mountain man named Caleb Morgan, who had never once in 10 years let a stranger past his cabin door until today. If stories about second chances, broken hearts, healing, and love, finding the ones the world gave up on speak to you, hit subscribe and stay with me to the very end. Drop the name of the city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far Eleanor and Caleb's story travels. Now let's go back to that freezing trading post, the moment everything changed. The trunk hit the dirt before Eleanor did. She heard it crack against the frozen ground, one hinge snapping loose, and she stood frozen at the bottom of the stagecoach steps, with her gloved hand still gripping the rail, waiting for someone, anyone, to say this was a mistake. Josiah Hargrove did not dismount his horse. He looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he never meant to pay. "You're not what the letter described," he said. Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "Mr. Hargrove, I wrote you honestly. I told you my age. I told you—" "You told me plenty," Hargrove cut in. "You didn't tell me you'd be built like a plow horse." Somebody near the trading post door laughed. A woman. Eleanor didn't turn to see who. "I have a ranch to run," Hargrove said. "I need a wife who can stand beside me in this territory. Not one who'll slow a wagon down. I can cook. I can keep books. I ran my father's entire mercantile ledger for 6 years without a single error." "I don't need a bookkeeper," Hargrove snapped. "I need a wife." He said the word wife like it was something she had failed to be simply by existing. Eleanor's chest burned, but she lifted her chin anyway. Her mother had taught her that much: you let them see you cry, you've already lost. "Then I reckon you ordered wrong, Mr. Hargrove," she said, steadier now, "because I am not a mistake you get to send back." Hargrove's jaw tightened. For one heartbeat, something almost like shame passed over his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cold irritation. "I expected a wife," he said, "not a burden." He turned his horse. "Wait." Eleanor stepped forward and her boot caught the icy rut in the road. She stumbled, one hand slamming against the stagecoach wheel to keep from falling, and the crowd outside the trading post laughed again, louder this time. Hargrove didn't look back. He rode off down the frozen road, and within seconds, the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the wind, leaving Eleanor standing alone beside a cracked trunk in a town that had already decided in under 2 minutes exactly who she was. Too heavy, too plain, too unwanted. A woman near the porch pulled her shawl tighter and muttered to her companion, just loud enough to carry. "Poor thing traveled 2,000 miles for that." "Serves her right thinking a man like Hargrove would want her," the other replied. "Some women just don't know their place." Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear. Instead, she knelt down in the frozen mud and began gathering the scattered contents of her trunk. A folded blue dress, a small tin of her mother's buttons, a stack of letters tied with string, shoving them back inside with shaking fingers, while half the town watched like she was a show put on for their entertainment. "You gonna sit in the road all day, or you got somewhere to be?" Eleanor looked up. The trading post owner, a wiry man named Otis Pruitt, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, chewing on something unpleasant. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, and hated how thin her voice sounded. "The next stage doesn't come through for 10 days. "Not my problem," Pruitt said. "I got no room to board strangers who can't pay. I have money, not enough, I'd wager." He looked her over the same way Hargrove had, like she was cargo somebody forgot to claim. "Man like Hargrove don't change his mind easy. You'd best figure out where you're sleeping tonight, or the mountain'll figure it out for you." A younger man stepped off the porch, then boots crunching in the frost, a grin already spreading across his face that made Eleanor's stomach turn before he even spoke. "I got a spare room," he said, looking her up and down slow. "Might work something out. Woman your size, you'd earn your keep easy enough scrubbing floors." Eleanor's spine went rigid. "I am not for hire, sir." "Didn't say hire." His grin widened. "Said work something out." "That's enough." The voice came from behind her, low and even, but it cut through the cold air like a blade through rope. Every head on that porch turned. Eleanor turned too. The man standing there was tall, in a way that made the doorway behind him look small, wrapped in a heavy coat, dusted with mountain snow, a rifle slung over one shoulder like it belonged there, more than his own arm. His jaw was set hard beneath a rough beard, and his eyes pale gray, unreadable, moved from the grinning man to Eleanor and back again. "Caleb Morgan," Pruitt said, surprised. "Didn't figure you'd be down off that mountain till spring. Needed supplies." Caleb didn't look at Pruitt. He was still looking at the man who'd made the offer, and something in that stare made the man's grin falter and drop. "Wasn't doing nothing wrong," the young man muttered. "Just talking." "Walk away," Caleb said. 2 words, flat as stone. The man walked away. Nobody argued with Caleb Morgan. Eleanor would learn later that half the valley owed him something. A life pulled from a frozen river, a herd found after a blizzard, a debt nobody spoke of out loud. But in that moment, all she understood was that a stranger had stepped between her and a threat without being asked, and hadn't once looked at her like she was something to be mocked. He crouched down beside her, gathering the last of her scattered belongings without a word, and set them back inside the cracked trunk with more care than Hargrove had shown her in the entire 2 minutes he'd bothered to speak to her. "You hurt?" he asked, not looking up. "No," Eleanor said. Then quieter. "Not the kind that shows." Caleb's hands stilled for half a second. Just half a second. Then he closed the trunk lid and stood, offering his hand to help her up. She hesitated. She wasn't used to men offering anything without expecting something back. But she took it anyway, and he pulled her to her feet like she weighed nothing at all. "You got somewhere to be, ma'am?" he asked. "No," Eleanor said. "I don't suppose I do." Caleb looked at Pruitt. "She stay here tonight." "I told her I got no room." "Then I'll pay for a room she don't have," Caleb said, already reaching into his coat for a small leather pouch. He counted out coins and set them on the porch rail without breaking eye contact with Pruitt. 1 week. Food included. Pruitt's mouth opened like he wanted to argue, took one look at Caleb's face, and thought better of it. 1 week, he agreed. Eleanor stared at Caleb, stunned. "Mr. Morgan, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," Caleb said simply. "I offered." Why? It was the only question that mattered, and Eleanor watched his face carefully as she asked it, half expecting him to say something about pity or duty or the kind of Christian charity men like to perform in front of an audience. Instead, Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The wind picked up around them, tugging at Eleanor's torn shawl. And somewhere behind them, Pruitt's wife was already whispering to another woman about the stranger and his sudden generosity. "Man leaves a woman standing alone in the cold," Caleb finally said. "Town ought to be ashamed of itself not laughing." He shouldered his rifle again. "I ain't got much use for towns that forget how to be decent." He turned to go. "Wait," Eleanor said, and he stopped. "I don't even know if I'll see you again. I never got to thank you properly." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close to where one might live if he let it. "Ain't necessary, ma'am." "Eleanor," she said. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker." He studied her for a moment, like her name was something worth remembering. "Caleb Morgan," he said, though Pruitt had already given that away. "Try and stay out of trouble till the next stage, Miss Whitaker." He walked off toward the trading post's small stable, and Eleanor stood watching him go, her chest tight with something she couldn't name, not quite gratitude, not quite hope, but close enough to both that it frightened her a little. She didn't see him again that day. But that night, lying in the small back room Pruitt had grudgingly cleared out for her, Eleanor pulled her mother's letters from the trunk and read them by candlelight the same way she had every night since her mother passed. One line near the bottom of the last letter seemed to burn brighter than the rest. "A man's worth ain't in what he says when things are easy, Eleanor. It's in what he does when nobody's watching and nothing's owed to him." She thought of Hargrove riding away without a backward glance. She thought of Caleb Morgan, a stranger counting coins onto a porch rail for a woman who had nothing to offer him in return. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Hargrove's voice. "I expected a wife, not a burden," and felt that same hollow shame crawl back into her chest. She had spent her whole life being weighed and measured by men who never once asked what she carried inside her, only what she looked like carrying it. By the third morning, word had spread through Blackridge like fire through dry grass. Everywhere Eleanor went, she felt eyes on her, some pitying, most simply curious, a few openly cruel. Mrs. Pruitt made a point of commenting loud enough to be heard that she couldn't imagine what kind of man would send a woman 2,000 miles just to leave her standing in the road. "Some men don't know a good thing when it's staring them in the face," said an older woman, stacking flour sacks near the counter, the first kind word Eleanor had heard since stepping off that stagecoach. "Thank you," Eleanor said, surprised. "Don't thank me, child, I'm only stating fact." The woman squinted at her. "You're the one Hargrove sent packing?" "I suppose I am." "Well?" The woman went back to her sacks. "Hargrove's got a reputation for wanting things he can't keep. You're better off, though I doubt that comforts you much right now." It didn't. Not entirely. But it was the first crack of light Eleanor had seen since arriving, and she held on to it. She spent the following days doing what she always did. When the world made her feel small, she made herself useful. She helped Mrs. Pruitt organize the store's ledger, which had clearly not been balanced correctly in over a year, correcting 3 separate errors within an hour that left the woman staring at her like she'd performed a magic trick. "You did all that just by looking?" Mrs. Pruitt asked. "I kept my father's books for 6 years," Eleanor said. "Numbers don't lie even when people do." It was the first time since arriving that anyone had looked at her with something other than pity or scorn, and Eleanor found she liked it more than she expected, not because it made her feel clever, but because for one small moment she was seen for something other than her body, her failure, her unwanted arrival. On the 5th day, 2 men rode into Blackridge that Eleanor didn't recognize. Well-dressed for the territory, their coats too clean for men who worked land. They spoke with Pruitt in low voices near the counter, and though Eleanor wasn't trying to listen, she caught fragments as she swept the floor nearby. "Survey lines need to match what Hargrove filed with the land office. Railroad won't run through unless the acreage checks clean. Just make sure nobody looks too close at the old boundary markers." Eleanor kept sweeping, her pulse quickening despite herself. She didn't know what it meant, not fully, but she recognized the shape of it. The careful, practiced way men spoke when they were hiding numbers that didn't add up. She'd heard that same tone in her father's mercantile more than once, right before a supplier was caught skimming inventory. She said nothing. It wasn't her business, not really, not anymore. Not after Hargrove had made it painfully clear she had no place here. But she noticed. She remembered. And some small, stubborn part of her tucked the memory away, like a coin saved for later, the way she'd been taught to save everything that might someday matter. That evening, Caleb Morgan returned. He came through the trading post door with the same quiet weight he'd carried before, snow dusting his shoulders, and Eleanor felt something in her chest lift before she could stop it. "Miss Whitaker," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Still here, I see." "Still here," she agreed. 3 more days until the stage returns. Caleb's jaw worked like he was chewing on something he hadn't decided whether to say. Finally, he asked, "And after that, where do you go?" Eleanor hesitated. It was a question she'd been avoiding since the moment Hargrove rode off. "I don't rightly know. Back east, I suppose. There's nothing left for me there either, but there's less shame in nothing familiar than nothing strange." "That ain't much of a plan." "It's the only one I've got, Mr. Morgan." He was quiet a moment, studying her the way he had that first day, like he was trying to read something written beneath her skin. "I got a proposition," he said finally, Ain't romantic, and it ain't charity, so don't go thinking either. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I got a cabin up the mountain. Been managing on my own a long while, but winter's coming hard this year, and there's more work than one set of hands can carry. Smoking meat mending, keeping the place from falling in on itself. I need help. You need somewhere that ain't this trading post looking at you like a stray dog. He shifted his weight. Ain't proper, I know that. Man and woman under one roof unmarried. Folks'll talk. Folks already talk, Eleanor said quietly. That they do. And what happens when the work's done, when winter breaks? Then you decide what you want to do, Caleb said. I ain't asking for nothing permanent. Just asking you not to freeze to death out of stubborn pride is all. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Every instinct she'd built over 28 years of being underestimated told her to be cautious. Men rarely offered anything without expecting payment, eventually one way or another. But there was something in the plainness of Caleb's offer, the utter absence of flattery or pity in it, that made her believe him more than she'd believed anyone in a very long time. Why me? She asked. There must be women in this town better suited to mountain work than a bookkeeper's daughter. Maybe, Caleb said. But I ain't seen a single one of them stand up the way you did first day you got here. Man rode off and left you in the mud, whole town laughed, and you still had enough backbone left to argue with Pruitt over a fair price for your room. He shrugged like it was simple. Reckon that's worth something where I'm headed. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite relief, but a small, fragile thing that had been buried under humiliation for 5 long days. All right, Mr. Morgan, she said. I'll come. Caleb, he corrected. If we're going to be sharing a roof, might as well drop the mister. Caleb, Eleanor repeated. Then it's Eleanor. He nodded once like the matter was settled, and something in his shoulders eased that hadn't been there a moment before. They left at first light. The trail up the mountain was nothing like the roads Eleanor had known back in Illinois, steep, ice-slicked cut through with loose stone that shifted beneath her boots without warning. Caleb walked ahead carrying most of the supplies himself, despite Eleanor's protests, and though he said little, he slowed his pace whenever the distance between them grew too wide. She fell twice in the first hour. Both times before she could even reach for a handhold. Caleb was there hauling her upright with one strong arm, like it cost him nothing. You don't have to keep catching me, she said the second time, breathless and embarrassed. Don't mind it, Caleb said. Rather catch you than watch you tumble down a mountain on my account. By midday, the trail narrowed along a ridge with a sheer drop on one side, and Eleanor's legs burned with an exhaustion she hadn't felt since her father's mercantile days of hauling flour sacks. She refused to complain. She refused to give this mountain or this man any reason to believe Hargrove had been right about her. Then the ground gave way. One moment Eleanor was walking the next. The icy shelf beneath her boot cracked and slid, and she was falling toward the ridge's edge with a scream tearing out of her throat before she even understood what was happening. Eleanor. Caleb moved faster than she'd thought a man his size could move, closing the distance between them in a single lunge, and his arm caught her hard around the waist just as her foot slipped over open air. For one terrifying second, they both teetered at the edge. His boots dug into the ice, his whole body straining backward against her weight and the pull of the drop below. Then they were falling backward together, away from the edge, tumbling into the snowbank behind them. Caleb's arms wrapped around her the entire way down. They lay there a moment, breathless snow soaking through Eleanor's coat, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. You all right? Caleb asked, voice rough. Eleanor let out a shaky laugh that came out closer to a sob. I believe so. Though I imagine my dignity fell off that ridge without me. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. Dignity ain't much use to a person who's dead, he said, helping her sit up. Better to keep the person and lose the dignity. He didn't let go of her arm the rest of the climb. They reached the cabin as the light began to fade, the sky bruising purple over the peaks, and Eleanor stood at the threshold a moment, taking in the small wooden structure that would apparently be her home for the winter, smoke-stained, weathered, clearly built, and maintained by a man with no one to answer to but himself. "Ain't much," Caleb admitted, pushing the door open. "It's shelter," Eleanor said. "That's more than I had 5 days ago." Inside the cabin was smaller than she expected. One room, one bed shoved against the far wall. A table with a single chair, a cold hearth that hadn't seen a fire in days. The air smelled of old smoked leather, and the particular stillness of a place where a man had lived alone too long. Caleb caught her looking at the single bed and cleared his throat. "I'll take the floor. Ain't a discussion." "Caleb, I can't ask you to sleep on your own floor in your own home." "You ain't asking," he said, echoing his own words from days before. "I'm offering." Eleanor didn't argue further. She recognized even in that small exchange the shape of a man who made decisions and didn't much care to debate them, not out of arrogance she was beginning to understand, but out of a deep, quiet conviction about what was right and what wasn't. That first night while Caleb went to check on the animals in the small lean-to attached to the cabin, Eleanor rolled up her sleeves and began to work. She found a broom in the corner and swept years of dust from the floorboards. She discovered a torn blanket folded in a chest and began mending it by firelight, her needle moving quick and sure, a skill her mother had drilled into her alongside the ledgers back when a woman was expected to be useful in every possible way, or else be nothing at all. She found flour, salt pork, and dried beans in Caleb's meager stores, and set about making something that resembled a proper supper, humming under her breath the way she used to when her father's shop was busy and her hands were needed everywhere at once. When Caleb came back inside stomping snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway and stared. The fire was lit. The table was set with 2 plates instead of the usual one shoved carelessly onto the counter. The smell of cooking meat filled a cabin that had smelled of nothing but cold ash for longer than he cared to admit. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, voice unusually quiet. "I know," Eleanor said, not looking up from the stove. "I wanted to." Caleb sat down slowly, like the chair itself was unfamiliar to him in this new arrangement, and watched Eleanor move around his kitchen with a competence that unsettled something long buried in his chest. He'd spent 10 years building walls around this cabin around himself, convinced that solitude was safer than the alternative, that no one could disappoint him if he never let anyone close enough to matter. And yet here she was, mending his blankets, cooking his supper, filling silence he hadn't realized had grown so loud. "You're a strange woman, Eleanor Whitaker," he said finally. "I've been told worse," she replied, setting a plate in front of him. "Usually by men with less manners than you." Caleb almost laughed. It came out as something close to it, a rough exhale through his nose, the corner of his mouth twitching upward before he caught himself. "Eat," he said instead. "Long day tomorrow." They ate mostly in silence, though it wasn't the same silence that had filled the cabin for the past decade. This silence had warmth in it. This silence felt for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit something close to companionship. Later, as Eleanor lay on the narrow bed and listened to the wind pick up outside to Caleb's steady breathing from his bedroll near the hearth, she thought of Hargrove's cruel words, of the townspeople's laughter of every moment over the past 28 years, when she had been told in one way or another that she was too much and not enough all at once. And she thought of Caleb Morgan counting coins onto a porch rail, catching her at the edge of a cliff, sitting quietly at his own table while she filled his home with a warmth he clearly hadn't known he was missing. She didn't know what this arrangement would become. She didn't know if winter would end with her walking back down that mountain alone, or if something else entirely waited for her in the months ahead. But for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Eleanor Whitaker did not feel like a burden. She felt for the first time in longer than she could remember like she belonged somewhere. Outside, the wind howled harder against the cabin walls, carrying the first true warning of the winter storm that was already building somewhere beyond the peaks, one that neither of them could yet see coming. Morning came without warning. Gray light pressing through a single frost-covered window, and Eleanor woke to the sound of a knife against a whetstone. She sat up too fast, blankets sliding off her shoulders, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar walls. the unfamiliar smell of wood smoke and pine, until memory caught up with her all at once. Caleb sat near the cold hearth sharpening a hunting knife with slow, practiced strokes, his eyes on the blade instead of on her, though she suspected he'd heard her stir the second she moved. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. "You didn't." Eleanor smoothed her hair back, embarrassed by how deeply she'd slept, how heavy her limbs still felt. "I can't remember the last time I slept that long. Mountain air does that." Caleb set the knife down and stood stretching a back that had clearly spent the night on hard floorboards without complaint. "Figured we'd start with chores. You still willing, or you want to reconsider now that it's daylight and you can see what you agreed to?" Eleanor swung her legs over the side of the bed, chin lifting the way it had outside the trading post 3 days before. "I don't reconsider, Mr. Morgan. I told you that already." "Caleb," he corrected again, though there was the faintest curve at the edge of his mouth, this time something almost like approval. They ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples, and then Caleb walked her through the cabin's rhythms, the way a man might walk a new hand through a job he didn't quite trust anyone else to do right. There was the smokehouse out back, half full of venison that needed tending before it spoiled. There was a lean-to with 2 mules and a milk goat that needed feeding water, hauled up from a half-frozen creek that cut along the property's edge. There was wood to split, a wood pile dwindling faster than Caleb liked to admit with winter closing in early this year. "That's more work than one man can rightly keep up with," Eleanor observed, watching him gesture toward each task with the flat, tired resignation of someone who'd been failing at it quietly for longer than he wanted to say. "Been managing," Caleb said. "Managing isn't the same as thriving." He shot her a look sharp enough that she thought she'd overstepped, but there was no real heat behind it. "No," he admitted. "Reckon it ain't." They fell into work side by side, and Eleanor discovered quickly that Caleb Morgan did not believe in wasted motion. He moved through his chores with an economy that came from years of solitude. No one to talk to, no one to slow him down or speed him up. And at first Eleanor found herself struggling to match his pace, her arms burning as she split kindling with a hatchet too large for her hands. Sweat freezing against her skin the moment she paused to catch her breath. "You're gripping it wrong," Caleb said, watching her third failed swing bounce the hatchet uselessly off a knot in the wood. "I'm aware," Eleanor said through gritted teeth. "Choke up higher. Let the weight do the work, not your arm." She adjusted her grip, swung again, and this time the wood split clean in two, the pieces tumbling apart with a satisfying crack. Eleanor stared at the halved log like it had personally insulted her a moment before and redeemed itself just as quickly. "There it is," Caleb said, and something in his voice, not quite a compliment, but close-made warmth, spread through Eleanor's chest, despite the cold. They worked through the morning, mostly in silence, though it wasn't the strained silence of strangers forced together by circumstance. It was something else. Something Eleanor didn't have a name for, yet the quiet understanding of two people learning each other's rhythms, learning when to speak, and when the work itself said enough. It was midday when the goat started screaming. Eleanor had never heard an animal make that sound before, high and panicked, and she dropped the hatchet instinctively, heart slamming against her ribs as Caleb was already moving rifle in hand before she'd even registered he'd grabbed it. "Stay back!" he barked, already running toward the lean-to. Eleanor did not stay back. She followed at a distance close enough to see, and what she saw stopped her cold, a gray shape low against the snow near the lean-to's edge, lean and hungry-looking teeth bared at the terrified goat straining against its tether. "Wolf," Caleb said low, raising the rifle. The shot cracked across the mountain silence, and the wolf bolted before the bullet found it disappearing into the tree line in 3 long bounds. Caleb didn't lower the rifle right away, scanning the woods for a long moment, chest heaving before he finally exhaled and turned back to the shaking goat. "You could have been killed," Eleanor said, her voice trembling more than she wanted it to. "Wolf wasn't after me," Caleb said, checking the goat's tether, running his hands over its flank for injuries. "Was after her. Been circling the property for 2 weeks now. Winter's hard on them, same as everyone else." "You never mentioned wolves." "Didn't think to." He glanced at her, and something in her expression must have registered because his voice gentled slightly. "You're safe here, Eleanor." I wouldn't have brought you up this mountain if I thought otherwise. Eleanor nodded, though her pulse hadn't fully settled, and it was only later hauling water up from the half-frozen creek with her arms trembling from more than just the cold that she let herself admit the truth. She hadn't been afraid for herself in that moment. She'd been afraid for him. That evening after supper, Caleb pulled a small wooden box from beneath the bed and set it on the table, with the particular reluctance of a man showing someone a wound he usually kept hidden. "Trade ledger," he said. "Was gonna ask if you'd look it over sometime. Numbers ain't ever made much sense to me." Eleanor opened the box and found a mess of scrawled figures, torn receipts, half-legible notes scattered across a dozen loose pages, with no order to them whatsoever. She almost laughed, though she caught herself before it came out disrespectful. "Caleb," she said carefully, "how long has it been since anyone balanced this?" "Never exactly." "Never. I know what I'm owed, and what I owe mostly," he said, a little defensive now. "Keep it up here." He tapped his temple. "That's not a ledger, that's a memory. You're one bad winter away from losing entirely." Eleanor spread the papers out, already sorting them by instinct: dates in one pile, debts in another, trades completed separated from trades still owed. "Give me an hour. I'll show you what you're actually working with." She worked by candlelight, while Caleb watched, arms crossed, clearly. Skeptical that a stack of chaos could be turned into anything useful in an hour. But Eleanor's hands moved with the same quiet confidence she'd shown at Pruitt's counter columns, forming beneath her pencil, numbers falling into place like pieces of a puzzle only she could see. "You're being cheated," she said, finally turning the finished ledger toward him. Caleb straightened. "What?" "Here." She pointed to a column of figures. "Silas Boone at the trading post has been shorting your fur trades by roughly 15% for at least the past 2 seasons. Small enough each time that you wouldn't notice unless you were tracking the totals against what he actually paid out. But it adds up, significantly." Caleb stared at the numbers like they'd betrayed him personally. "You figured that out in an hour." "I figured that out in 20 minutes, Eleanor said. "The rest of the hour was making it legible." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing at all. He looked at the ledger, then at Eleanor. Something shifting behind his pale eyes that she couldn't quite read, not just surprise, but something closer to reassessment, like he was looking at her for the first time and seeing something he hadn't expected to find. "Hargrove was a fool," he said quietly. Eleanor's chest tightened at the name, unexpected. "What?" "Man had you standing right in front of him," Caleb said, "and all he saw was size. Didn't bother looking past it to see what you actually were." He shook his head. "Fool doesn't begin to cover it." Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever spoken about Hargrove's rejection like it was his failure rather than her own, and something in her throat went tight and hot in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "Thank you," she managed. "Wasn't flattery," Caleb said. "Was fact." They sat with that for a moment, the fire crackling low, the cabin holding a silence that felt entirely different from the one that had greeted her the first night. It was Eleanor who broke it, curiosity finally overtaking caution. "Caleb, can I ask you something?" "Reckon you're gonna, whether I say yes or not." "You live up here completely alone. No family, no wife, not even hired help until now. Why?" Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Eleanor thought she'd pushed too far, that the walls she'd started to see cracks in would slam shut again entirely. But he surprised her. "Had a family once," he said, voice low. "Wife. Little girl." Eleanor went very still. "Caleb." Fever took them both same winter 6 years back. He stared into the fire like it held the memory itself, flickering and distant. "Doctor was 3 days right away. By the time I got him up here, wasn't nothing left to save." "I'm so sorry." "Ain't looking for sympathy," Caleb said, though not unkindly. "Just answering your question. That's why I came up this mountain and mostly stayed here since. Easier to be alone than to watch something you love get taken from you again." Eleanor thought of her own losses, her mother slow and painful, Her father 2 years after that, the particular loneliness of being the last one left in a house too big for one person. She understood in a way, words couldn't quite reach the specific architecture of grief that built walls instead of doors. "Grief makes hermits of all of us one way or another," she said softly. "Mine just looked different than yours. I filled the silence with numbers instead of mountains." Caleb looked at her, then really looked something raw passing between them that neither seemed ready to name. "Get some sleep," he said finally, voice rough. "Long day tomorrow too." Eleanor nodded, though sleep felt very far away as she lay on the narrow bed that night, listening to Caleb's breathing settle near the hearth, turning his words over in her mind. Easier to be alone than to watch something you love get taken from you again. She understood that fear better than she wanted to admit, the particular terror of caring about someone only to lose them, or worse, to be discarded by them, the way Hargrove had discarded her without a second thought. The next few days fell into a rhythm that Eleanor found herself, despite everything, beginning to cherish. Mornings were chores and quiet companionship. Afternoons were Caleb teaching her things she'd never needed to know in Illinois, how to read weather in the shape of clouds gathering over the peaks, how to set a snare, how to tell fresh tracks from old ones in the snow. Evenings were the ledger slowly transformed under her careful hand into something Caleb could actually use, alongside conversations that grew a little longer, a little easier each night. It was on the fourth day that trouble found them. Eleanor heard the horses before she saw them, 2 riders coming up the mountain trail, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who expected to be received rather than questioned. Caleb straightened from the woodpile, immediately rifle, never far from reach, and something in his posture shifted from relaxed to alert in the space of a heartbeat. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Caleb." "Please, Eleanor." She didn't argue, though she didn't go far either, watching from the cabin's cracked doorway as the 2 riders drew up in front of Caleb, their coats too clean, their horses too well fed for men who worked the land honestly. Eleanor recognized them immediately. The same 2 men from Pruitt's trading post, the ones who'd spoken in low voices about survey lines and boundary markers. "Caleb Morgan," the taller of the 2 said, tipping his hat with false pleasantness. "Didn't expect to find you keeping company." "Wasn't aware my company was your business, Talbot," Caleb said flatly. "Just making conversation." Talbot's eyes drifted toward the cabin, toward Eleanor's shadow in the doorway, and something calculating crossed his face before he looked away. "Actually, we're here on business of a different sort. Railroad surveys coming through this region next spring. Need to confirm boundary lines on properties along the northern ridge." "My boundary's been settled for 6 years," Caleb said. "Filed proper with the land office in Denver." "Filed proper, sure," the second man said, a heavy-set fellow with a nervous habit of adjusting his collar. "But things change, Mr. Morgan. Survey crews find discrepancies sometimes. Old markers shift. Records get reinterpreted." "Reinterpreted." Caleb's voice went colder. "That a fact or a threat, Whitfield? Just information." Talbot cut in smoothly. "Railroad's paying good money for land along this ridge, Morgan. Real good money. Man be a fool not to consider selling before the survey settles things one way or the other." "Not selling. Everyone says that." Talbot said, "Right up until the survey finds their boundary don't match what they thought they owned. Funny how that tends to happen to folks who won't sell." He smiled, thin and unpleasant. "We'll be back through in a few weeks. Give it some thought." They rode off without waiting for a response, and Eleanor stepped out of the cabin doorway the moment they were out of earshot, her mind already racing through everything she'd overheard at the trading post days before. "Caleb, that's the same men, the ones I told you I overheard talking about Hargrove's land." Caleb's expression darkened. "You said they mentioned boundary markers. They said Hargrove's acreage needed to match what he filed with the land office. They said something about making sure nobody looked too closely at the old boundaries." Eleanor's pulse quickened as pieces started fitting together in her mind, the same instinct that had caught Silas Boone's cheating, now sharpening toward something far larger. "Caleb, what if this isn't about your land specifically? What if it's about all the land along that ridge? What if someone's manipulating survey records to force people to sell before the railroad comes through? Caleb stared at her. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious pattern, Eleanor said. My father dealt with men like this in Illinois, not land, but inventory records always small enough to go unnoticed individually, but devastating in total. The way Talbot spoke, the way he threatened without quite threatening, that's not a man confident in an honest survey. That's a man softening you up for something he already knows is coming. Something shifted in Caleb's face, a suspicion Eleanor recognized, because she'd worn the same expression herself days ago, sweeping Pruitt's floor and listening to words that hadn't made sense until now. Hargrove, he said slowly. What about him? He owns half that northern ridge, Caleb said. Filed his claim same year I filed mine. If the railroad's paying for land up there and someone's manipulating boundary records to force a sale? He trailed off, working through the implication. Then Hargrove might not have rejected me because of how I look at all. Eleanor said quietly, the realization settling into her chest like a stone. He might have rejected me because a wife complicates things. Bachelor land claims can be challenged and consolidated more easily than a married man's homestead. If he's involved with Talbot and Whitfield, somehow a wife would be a liability, not an asset. The cabin fell silent except for the wind picking up outside, and Eleanor watched Caleb absorb this, his jaw working the way it did when he was fighting down anger. He didn't quite know where to aim yet. That's a mighty specific theory, built on overheard fragments, he said finally. Though there was no real doubt in his voice, more like a man testing a wound to see how deep it went. It's a theory I intend to prove, Eleanor said, and something in her tone made Caleb look at her sharply. I kept my father's ledgers for 6 years, Caleb. I know exactly what fraud looks like when someone's trying to hide it in plain sight. Give me access to the land office records, give me time with your ledger and whatever documentation you have on your own claim, and I'll find the pattern if it's there. That could be dangerous, Caleb said. Men like Talbot don't take kindly to being exposed. Men like Hargrove didn't take kindly to being seen as anything less than perfect either. Eleanor said, chin lifting in that same stubborn tilt Caleb was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers. I've spent my whole life being underestimated because of how I look. I'm done being underestimated because of it. If there's fraud happening on this mountain, I want to be the one who finds it. Caleb studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Worry, certainly. But underneath it, something that looked almost like admiration fighting its way to the surface. All right, he said finally. We'll look into it, together. The word together settled between them with more weight than either of them acknowledged out loud. Over the following days, the investigation became woven into their existing rhythm, threading through chores and meals and quiet evenings by the fire. Caleb produced every scrap of documentation he had on his own land claim, and Eleanor cross-referenced it against the ledger entries against dates, against the handful of old newspapers Caleb had kept for kindling that happened to mention railroad expansion plans for the territory. Here? Eleanor said one evening, nearly a week into the work, pointing to a set of figures that had been bothering her for days. Look at this survey date from 3 years ago compared to this one from last spring. Same boundary marker, 2 completely different measurements, nearly 40 acres difference. Caleb leaned over her shoulder close enough that Eleanor was suddenly acutely aware of him in a way that had nothing to do with land fraud. That's not a rounding error. No, Eleanor agreed, forcing her focus back to the numbers instead of the warmth radiating from where his shoulder nearly brushed hers. That's someone redrawing lines on paper to make legitimate homesteads look smaller than they actually are, likely to justify forcing a sale at a lower valuation, or to claim the difference as unclaimed land the railroad can purchase directly from the territory instead of from the homesteader. Son of a... Caleb caught himself glancing at Eleanor. Apologies. I've heard worse. Eleanor said, the ghost of a smile crossing her face despite the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Considerably worse, and recently. Caleb's expression darkened again at the reminder, though this time it wasn't aimed at Talbot or Whitfield. Hargrove. Hargrove, Eleanor confirmed. It was 2 nights later, with snow falling steady and thick outside the cabin windows, that Eleanor finally voiced the question that had been building in her chest since the ledger work began. "Caleb, if we prove this, if we actually find evidence that Talbot and Whitfield are manipulating survey records for the railroad, possibly with Hargrove's involvement, what happens then?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of wood by the fire, more out of habit than purpose. "Depends who we can get to listen. Land office in Denver's a long ride, and men with railroad money behind them tend to have friends in high places." He set the knife down. "But it's worth trying. Folks along this ridge are barely holding on to what they've got. If someone's stealing it out from under them on paper, they deserve to know." "I want to help," Eleanor said. "Not just with the numbers. I want to see this through." "Didn't figure you for the type to walk away from it." Caleb said something warm threading through his voice, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "You've got more grit than half the men I've known on this mountain, Eleanor Whitaker." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused to praise, that felt so entirely earned rather than performed. "That's kind of you to say." "Wasn't kindness," Caleb said, echoing his own words about Hargrove's foolishness days before. "Was fact." The fire popped between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the cabin filled with a silence that had grown warmer, closer, more charged than either of them was quite ready to acknowledge. It was Eleanor who finally broke it, needing to fill the space before it became something neither of them knew how to name. "Can I ask you something else about your wife?" Caleb's expression shuddered slightly, though he didn't refuse the question outright. "What do you want to know? Was she like me?" The question came out smaller than Eleanor intended, more vulnerable than she meant to reveal. "I only ask because I suppose I wonder if I remind you of her. If that's part of why you've been so generous." "No," Caleb said, and something in his directness made Eleanor brace herself for a comparison that might hurt more than help. "Sarah was small, delicate near as a bird, used to worry she'd blow away in a strong wind." He paused. "You don't remind me of her, Eleanor. Not in looks, not in manner. You remind me of something else entirely." "What's that?" Caleb hesitated, and Eleanor watched him choose his words with the same care he'd shown splitting wood, deliberate, unhurried, unwilling to waste effort on something that didn't matter. "You remind me there's a difference between being alone and being lonely," he said finally. "Spent 6 years telling myself those were the same thing. Convinced myself solitude was safer, simpler. Didn't realize how loud the quiet had gotten until you started filling it up." Eleanor's breath caught chest tight, with something she hadn't let herself feel in years, not since before her mother's illness, before the slow grinding loneliness of watching everyone she loved either die or disappoint her. "I've spent my whole life being told I was too much," she said quietly. "Too much size, too much opinion, too much everything a proper woman wasn't supposed to have. You're the first person who's ever made me feel like too much wasn't a flaw." Caleb's eyes held hers across the firelight, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed brave enough to voice fully. "Maybe it never was," he said. "Maybe folks just weren't looking hard enough." The moment stretched fragile and uncertain, and for a breathless second, Eleanor thought something might shift between them entirely. A word, a gesture, some bridge crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Then the goat screamed again outside, sharp and panicked, and Caleb was on his feet instantly. Rifle in hand, the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. This time, it wasn't a wolf. Eleanor followed him out into the snow-dusted dark, heart hammering, and found Caleb crouched near the lean-to, examining tracks in the fresh snow. Not the wide paw prints of a wolf, but boot prints. Human boot prints circling the property's edge before doubling back toward the trail. "Someone was here," Caleb said grimly. "Watching us. Or checking to see if we're home." Caleb straightened, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. "Talbot and Whitfield don't strike me as men who do their own dirty work personally, but they've got people who will." Eleanor's pulse spiked with something colder than the night air. "You think they know we're investigating them?" "Don't know," Caleb admitted. "But I don't like coincidences, and I especially don't like strange tracks circling my property 2 days after Talbot threatened me on my own land." He turned to Eleanor, expression hard. "From here on, you don't go anywhere alone. Not to the creek, not to the woodpile. Understood? Caleb, I'm not made of glass." "Never said you were—" Caleb cut in, voice rough with something that sounded uncomfortably close to fear. "But if these men are willing to threaten homesteaders over survey lines, I don't much care to find out what they're willing to do to a woman digging through their fraud. Please, Eleanor." The please landed differently than his usual directness, softer, more exposed, and Eleanor found she couldn't argue with it, even if she'd wanted to. "All right," she said quietly. "Together then." "Together," Caleb agreed. They didn't sleep easily that night, both of them acutely aware of the tracks in the snow of the danger their discovery had apparently already invited. Eleanor lay awake long after Caleb's breathing evened out near the hearth, staring at the ceiling beams, turning over everything they'd found. The falsified survey measurements, Talbot's thinly veiled threats, the unsettling coincidence of Hargrove's land, bordering the very ridge the railroad wanted. She thought of Hargrove's face the moment he'd rejected her, the cold calculation underneath the cruelty. She'd assumed it was simple vanity, simple shallowness. But what if it had been something colder? Still a man protecting a scheme unwilling to let a sharp-eyed bookkeeper's daughter get close enough to notice what he was hiding. The thought settled into her chest, like a coal hot and steady, burning away some of the shame she'd carried since stepping off that stagecoach. Perhaps she hadn't been rejected for being too much. Perhaps she'd been rejected because Hargrove, on some instinctive level, had sensed exactly how dangerous her eye for numbers might become to whatever he was building. The following morning brought fresh snow and fresh resolve. Caleb rode down to check on a neighboring homestead. An elderly widow named Mrs. Callahan, who'd lived alone on the ridge for going on 15 years, insisting Eleanor stay close to the cabin while he was gone, and Eleanor used the solitude to dig deeper into the ledger, cross-referencing every scrap of documentation against dates, against names, against the pattern slowly emerging beneath her careful pencil marks. By the time Caleb returned, jaw tight with barely contained anger, Eleanor had found something that made her blood run cold. "Caleb," she said before he'd even removed his coat, "Mrs. Callahan, does she own land along the northern ridge?" 40 acres, Caleb said. "Why?" "Because her name's here." Eleanor turned the ledger toward him, pointing to a set of entries she'd cross-referenced against an old newspaper clipping mentioning territorial land transfers. A parcel matching her acreage was quietly reassigned to territorial ownership 8 months ago, citing a boundary discrepancy resolved by survey correction. "If she doesn't know about this—" "She doesn't," Caleb said grimly. "She just told me the railroad men visited her last week too. Same conversation Talbot gave us. Offered her a fraction of what her land's worth, told her the survey might not favor her if she waited." "They're already moving on her," Eleanor said, horror creeping into her voice. "Caleb, if they've already reassigned acreage without her knowledge, that's not just fraud, that's theft. Actual theft dressed up in paperwork so it looks legal." Caleb sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair, the weight of what they'd uncovered settling visibly onto his shoulders. "She's 71 years old, Eleanor. Lives alone since her husband died. If they push her off that land—" "They won't," Eleanor said with a fierceness that surprised even herself. "Not if we can get this evidence in front of someone who'll listen before the railroad survey makes it official." "Caleb, I need everything. Every ledger, every old survey document, every newspaper mention of railroad land purchases in this territory. If the pattern holds the way I think it does, we're not looking at one act of fraud. We're looking at a systematic scheme to steal land from homesteaders who can't afford to fight back." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and entirely unguarded passing across his face. "You really think you can prove this?" "I know I can prove this," Eleanor said, and for the first time since Hargrove's cruel words had followed her off that stagecoach, she felt something other than shame settle into her chest. She felt purpose. They worked through the following days with a new urgency. Eleanor's pencil moving faster across pages as the pattern sharpened into something undeniable. parcel after parcel along the northern ridge, each one showing the same suspicious boundary correction in the months leading up to the railroad survey announcement. Each one belonging to homesteaders, too old, too isolated, or too powerless to challenge the paperwork. "It's not random," Eleanor said one evening, exhaustion and excitement warring in her voice as she laid out the pattern across the table. "Look at who's being targeted. Widows, elderly bachelors, families with no legal counsel nearby. They're choosing the homesteaders least likely to fight back one parcel at a time, so no single theft looks large enough to draw scrutiny." "Except yours," Caleb said quietly. Eleanor looked up. "What?" "My claim ain't a widow's 40 acres, Eleanor. It's 160 prime timber and water rights sitting square in the middle of the ridge they need for the rail line." Caleb's expression hardened. "They can't quietly reassign a chunk of that without me noticing, which is likely why Talbot came in person instead of just filing paperwork like they did with Mrs. Callahan. They need me gone, or they need me married and complicated enough to negotiate around, or they need me scared enough to sell. And if none of that works..." Caleb's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. Eleanor felt fear coiled tight in her stomach, not for herself this time, but for him. For the man who had pulled her from a cliff's edge without hesitation, who had defended her against a town's cruelty without expecting anything in return, who was now standing directly in the path of men willing to steal from widows and threaten homesteaders to clear a railroad's way. "Then we make sure it doesn't come to that," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "We finish the investigation. We get proof solid enough that no land office, no judge, no railroad company can ignore it. And we do it before they realize how close we already are." Caleb reached across the table, then his hand covering hers where it rested against the ledger, and the gesture was so simple, so unpracticed, that it landed with more weight than any grand declaration could have. "We," he said quietly. "I like the sound of that more than I probably should." Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest, and for a moment, neither of them moved his hand warm over hers, the fire casting soft light across a cabin that had transformed in the space of little more than a week from a lonely man's fortress into something that felt dangerously close to a home. "Caleb," she whispered. "Don't," he said, though not unkindly, pulling his hand back with visible reluctance. "Don't say something you might regret once winter breaks, and you've got choices in front of you that ain't a mountain cabin and a stubborn man's company." "What if I don't regret it?" Eleanor asked the question braver than anything she'd said since stepping off that stagecoach. Caleb's jaw tightened, something raw and unguarded flickering behind his eyes before he forced it back down. "Then we'll talk about it when this business with Talbot's settled, and you're safe, and neither of us is deciding things out of fear or gratitude instead of something real." Eleanor wanted to argue that what she felt wasn't fear or gratitude, that it had grown into something far more solid over the past week of shared work and shared danger and shared silence by firelight. But she recognized in the careful way Caleb held himself back the same protective instinct that had made him sleep on his own cold floor, rather than presume anything from her, a man determined to give her every choice Hargrove had stolen from her the moment he rode away. "All right," she said softly, "when this is settled." The days that followed carried a new tension beneath their partnership, not unwelcome, but charged every accidental touch during chores, every lingering glance across the ledger's careful columns, humming with something neither of them named aloud. They finished cataloging the fraudulent parcels, 7 in total, each one representing a homesteader's life work quietly stolen through falsified paperwork. They drafted a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Denver, Eleanor's careful hand transforming raw evidence into an argument no reasonable official could dismiss. But the tracks in the snow returned twice more that week. Always at the property's edge, always when Caleb was away checking on neighbors or hunting for supplies that were running dangerously low as the weather worsened. "They know," Caleb said grimly, examining the fresh prints on the 5th morning snow falling harder, now the wind carrying a bite that promised worse weather ahead. "They're watching to see when I leave you alone." "Then don't leave me alone," Eleanor said, though even as she said it, she understood the impossibility of it. Chores needed doing, supplies needed hunting, and a mountain, winter didn't pause for caution. Can't watch you every hour. Caleb admitted frustration threading through his voice. But I can make sure you're armed at minimum. You know how to shoot? No, Eleanor said. I know how to keep a ledger, Caleb, not fire a rifle. Then it's time you learned. That afternoon, despite the worsening weather, Caleb walked her through the basics of his old shotgun, how to load it, how to brace against the kick, how to aim without flinching. Eleanor's first shot went wide, startling a flock of birds from a nearby tree and nearly knocking her backward with the recoil. Again, Caleb said, steadying her shoulders with his hands close enough that Eleanor lost focus on the target entirely, acutely aware, instead of his warmth at her back, his voice low near her ear. I can't concentrate with you standing so close, she admitted, cheeks warming despite the cold. Caleb went very still. Would you rather I step back? No, Eleanor said, honestly surprising herself. I don't believe I would. Something shifted in the air between them, charged and fragile, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the shotgun forgotten between her hands. It was the sound of distant hoofbeats that broke the moment, not the two riders from before, but a single horse moving fast, urgent, and Caleb's expression hardened instantly back into alertness as he stepped away, rifle already in hand. Get inside, he said. This time, Eleanor didn't argue. But instead of Talbot or Whitfield, the rider who came into view was a young boy no older than 12 cheeks, red from cold and exertion, nearly falling off his horse in his haste to dismount. Mr. Morgan, the boy gasped. Mrs. Callahan sent me, said to fetch you quick. 2 men came to her place this morning with papers, said the land office already approved the boundary. Change said she's got until spring to vacate or they'll have the sheriff remove her by force. Caleb's face went white with fury. That ain't legal. Not without a formal hearing. They had papers, the boy insisted. Official-looking ones with seals and everything. Mrs. Callahan's beside herself, Mr. Morgan. Don't know what to do. Eleanor stepped forward, despite Caleb's earlier instructions, her mind already racing. Caleb, if they're moving this fast on Mrs. Callahan, it means they know we're getting close. This isn't a coincidence. Someone's accelerating the timeline because they're afraid of what we might already have. Then we move faster too, Caleb said, already reaching for his coat. Eleanor, I need you to stay here with the boy while I ride to Callahan's place and see these papers myself. If they're forged, I'll know it. Man doesn't run a homestead 6 years without learning to spot official paperwork from fraud. I'm coming with you, Eleanor said immediately. Eleanor, I'm the one who can spot the exact irregularities in the boundary language, Caleb. You said yourself you don't have the eye for numbers that I do. If there's a flaw in their paperwork, I'm more likely to find it than you are, and Mrs. Callahan doesn't have time for us to debate this. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue further, every protective instinct in him rebelling against the idea of riding into potential danger with Eleanor beside him. But something in her expression, the same stubborn, unshakable resolve that had first caught his attention outside Pruitt's trading post, made him relent. Stay close, he said instead. Closer than close. If anything feels wrong, you get on that horse and you ride. You don't wait for me, understood? Understood, Eleanor said, though she had no intention of leaving him behind if trouble found them. They rode hard through worsening snow, the boy leading the way back toward Mrs. Callahan's homestead, and Eleanor's heart hammered with a mixture of fear and fierce determination that felt entirely unfamiliar and entirely welcome after a lifetime of being told to shrink herself smaller, to want less, to expect less from the world around her. Whatever waited for them at Mrs. Callahan's homestead, whatever danger Talbot and Whitfield's accelerating scheme now posed, Eleanor Whitaker rode toward it with a rifle she barely knew how to use and a resolve that Hargrove, in his cruelty, had never once managed to touch. The wind howled around them as the homestead came into view, smoke rising thin and worried from its chimney, and somewhere beyond the ridge clouds were gathering thick and dark over the peaks. The first true signs of a storm building that neither of them caught up in the urgency of the moment, yet understood would soon change everything. Mrs. Callahan met them at her door before Caleb even swung down from his horse. A folded stack of papers clutched to her chest like something that might be torn from her hands at any moment. "Caleb, thank the Lord," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't know who else to send for." "Show me the papers, Mrs. Callahan," Caleb said, already moving toward her. The old woman's hands shook as she passed them over, and Eleanor stepped in close eyes, scanning the document before Caleb had even finished unfolding it fully. Official letterhead. A territorial seal pressed into the corner. Language dense with legal phrasing designed to intimidate rather than inform. "They said I've got till spring," Mrs. Callahan said. "Said the survey found my northern boundary sits 11 feet onto railroad right-of-way, and since I can't prove otherwise, the land reverts to territorial claim." Eleanor's eyes moved fast down the page, the same instinct that had caught Silas Boone's cheating, now working through legal language instead of ledger columns. "Mrs. Callahan, when was your homestead originally surveyed?" 1861. My husband filed it himself." "And this new survey, do you know who conducted it?" "Didn't say, just had a name at the bottom. Some surveyor out of Denver I never heard of." Eleanor turned the page toward Caleb, tapping a line near the bottom, with a finger that had gone cold despite her gloves. "Caleb, look at this signature date." Caleb leaned in, and Eleanor watched his jaw tighten as he read it. "Says the survey was conducted 8 months ago," he said slowly. "Now look at the filing date stamped at the top." His eyes moved up the page, and Eleanor watched the moment it landed. The exact instant fury replaced confusion on his face. "Filing dates from 2 weeks ago," he said. "Someone backdated the survey by 8 months, which means," Eleanor said, "either the surveyor made an extraordinary coincidence of an error, or someone manufactured this document recently and dated it to look like it predates the railroad announcement, so it appears less suspicious. Mrs. Callahan, did anyone from the land office ever actually come out to your property to measure anything?" "No," the old woman said, understanding dawning slow and painful across her weathered face. "Nobody ever came. Just these 2 men with their papers and their false politeness." "Then this survey doesn't exist," Eleanor said, feeling something fierce and vindicating settle into her chest despite the horror of what they'd uncovered. "It's fabricated from nothing. Caleb, this isn't just evidence of fraud. This is proof of forgery, a manufactured government document with a false date. And I'd wager a fictional surveyor who doesn't actually work for the Territorial Land Office at all." Caleb straightened, something dangerous moving behind his eyes. Whitfield mentioned a name, man named Peterson, conducting the survey work. "There's no Peterson employed by the Denver Land Office," Eleanor said. "I'd stake everything I have on it. Men like Talbot don't hire real surveyors when a fake signature does the job just as well and costs far less." Mrs. Callahan sank into a chair near her hearth, hands pressed to her mouth. "They can't take my land on a lie." "They won't," Caleb said, kneeling in front of her, voice gentler than Eleanor had heard it since that first conversation outside Pruitt's trading post. "I promise you that, Mrs. Callahan. Whatever it takes." It was then that the sound of approaching horses reached them, not one rider this time, but several, moving with purpose rather than the unhurried arrogance Talbot had shown before. Caleb was on his feet, instantly moving toward the window, and Eleanor watched his shoulders go rigid. "It's them," he said. "Talbot, Whitfield, and 2 more I don't recognize." "They know we're here," Eleanor said, pulse spiking. "Or they're here for Mrs. Callahan regardless, and we've just walked into the middle of it." The old woman's face went ashen. "What do we do?" Caleb's hand moved to his rifle, resting near the door, and Eleanor felt fear coil tight and cold through her chest, not for herself, but for the reckless, dangerous math of 1 armed man against 4 riders on a homestead with nowhere to run. "Eleanor," Caleb said, voice low and urgent. "Take Mrs. Callahan out the back. There's a root cellar behind the smokehouse. Get inside, Bar. The door don't come out till I come for you." "I'm not leaving you out here alone against 4 men. You're not staying to get caught in a gunfight over a widow's homestead," Caleb said, and there was no room for argument in his voice. This time, only the same flat, immovable certainty he'd shown the man who'd threatened her outside Pruitt's trading post. "Please, Eleanor. I need to know you're safe so I can think straight." Eleanor's chest ached with the unfairness of it, the impossible choice between her own safety and leaving him to face danger alone. But she saw something in his eyes that stopped her protest cold. Not fear for himself, but a desperate, unguarded plea that revealed exactly how much her safety had come to matter to him. "Come find us," she said instead. "As soon as you can. Count on it." She helped Mrs. Callahan through the back door and across the frozen yard toward the root cellar, the old woman's breath coming in frightened gasps, and Eleanor's own heart hammering with every step, straining to hear what was happening at the front of the homestead. The cellar door was heavy, half-frozen shut, and Eleanor had to throw her full weight against it twice before it finally gave way, ushering Mrs. Callahan down into the cold, dark space before pulling it shut behind them and dropping the wooden bar into place. "You should have stayed with him," Mrs. Callahan whispered in the darkness. "A man like that facing 4 riders alone." "He asked me to keep you safe," Eleanor said, though her own voice trembled with the same fear. "I intend to honor that." Above them, muffled through the cellar's thick walls, Eleanor heard voices. Talbot's smooth drawl. Caleb's flat, dangerous replies, words she couldn't quite make out, but tones she understood perfectly. Tension stretched taut as a wire, and Eleanor pressed her ear against the cellar door, straining to hear more. Her hand instinctively finding Mrs. Callahan's in the darkness and gripping it tight. Then a gunshot cracked through the cold air. Eleanor's whole body flinched, a scream catching in her throat before she could stop it, and Mrs. Callahan's grip on her hand turned bruising. "Caleb!" Eleanor gasped. A second shot followed further away this time, and then shouting horses, screaming hooves pounding hard against frozen ground, and then silence. A silence so complete and so sudden that Eleanor's heart seemed to stop entirely inside her chest, waiting for something, anything, to break it. "We have to go up there," Eleanor said, already moving toward the bar across the cellar door. "Eleanor, wait?" "I can't wait, Mrs. Callahan. I can't sit down here not knowing if he's—" Her voice broke on the word, and she didn't finish the sentence, couldn't finish it, because finishing it made the possibility real in a way she wasn't prepared to survive. She threw the bar aside and pushed through the cellar door, scrambling up into the yard with her skirts tangling around her legs, eyes scanning wildly for any sign of Caleb. He was standing. Relief hit Eleanor so hard, her knees nearly buckled beneath her, but it was short-lived because as she got closer, she saw the dark stain spreading across his shoulder, saw the way he was gripping his arm, saw the pallor beneath his weathered skin. "Caleb, I'm all right," he said, though his voice was tight with obvious pain, and he swayed slightly as she reached him. "You are not all right. You've been shot." "Grazed," Caleb corrected, though the amount of blood soaking through his coat suggested it was considerably more than a graze. "Whitfield's man got jumpy when I told them the survey was forged. Fired before Talbot could stop him. They rode off once I put a bullet close enough to remind them I wasn't going down easy." "We need to get you back to the cabin," Eleanor said, already moving to support his weight, her earlier terror transforming instantly into fierce, focused purpose. "Now, Caleb, before that wound gets worse, or they come back with more men." "Mrs. Callahan." "I'll be all right," the old woman said, stepping forward despite her own trembling hands. "Go on, both of you, and Caleb, thank you for everything." Caleb nodded, though the motion clearly cost him, and Eleanor helped him toward his horse with an urgency that left no room for the fear still hammering through her chest. They needed to move, and they needed to move fast, because even as she glanced upward, she saw what she'd been too frightened to notice moments before. The sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise, clouds rolling thick and low over the peaks, and the wind, that had been merely cold an hour before, now carried a bite that promised something far worse was coming. "Storm's moving in fast," Caleb said through gritted teeth, reading the same signs Eleanor was only beginning to understand. "We need to reach the cabin before it breaks, or we won't reach it at all." They rode hard. Caleb slumped forward slightly in his saddle. Jaw clenched against pain, he refused to voice, and Eleanor kept pace beside him, one hand ready to catch him if he faltered, her own fear for his injury, warring with the growing dread of the storm gathering violent and fast above them. The first snow hit them halfway up the mountain trail, thin and stinging, and within minutes it had thickened into something far more dangerous. Visibility dropping so fast that Eleanor could barely make out Caleb's shape riding beside her. Caleb, we need to find shelter. We're not going to make the cabin. We're close, Caleb shouted over the wind, though his voice had gone thinner, weaker than she liked. Half-mile more. The half-mile felt endless. The trail nearly invisible beneath snow that swirled and howled around them, with a violence Eleanor had never experienced, wind cutting through her coat like it wasn't there at all. And twice she lost sight of Caleb entirely. Panic surging through her chest, until his shape reappeared through the white chaos ahead. When the cabin finally emerged, dark and solid against the storm, Eleanor could have wept with relief. She half-dragged Caleb from his horse, his weight heavier against her than she expected, blood loss and exhaustion clearly taking their toll. And together they stumbled through the cabin door into relative shelter, the storm screaming against the walls behind them like something alive and furious at being denied. "Sit!" Eleanor commanded, already moving toward the small store of supplies Caleb kept for emergencies, her hands finding clean cloth and the small bottle of whiskey he used for both drinking and doctoring in equal measure. "Let me see the wound." Caleb lowered himself into the single chair, and Eleanor worked his coat off his shoulder with careful, urgent hands, sucking in a breath at the sight of the wound beneath an ugly furrow along the outer curve of his shoulder, deep enough to have bled steadily through the ride, though mercifully not deep enough to have struck bone. "Could have been worse," Caleb said, watching her face. "Could have been considerably better, too." Eleanor snapped, fear sharpening her voice more than she intended. "Hold still." She cleaned the wound with hands that trembled despite her best effort to steady them. Caleb hissing sharply when the whiskey hit raw flesh, and Eleanor forced herself to focus entirely on the mechanics of the task pressure cleaning binding, rather than the terror still pounding through her chest at how close that bullet had come to something far worse than a shoulder. "You're shaking," Caleb observed quietly, watching her hands work. "I nearly lost you today," Eleanor said, voice cracking on the admission before she could stop it. "I sat in that cellar listening to gunshots, not knowing if you were alive or dead, and I have never in my entire life felt so completely helpless." "Eleanor, don't," she said, tying off the bandage with more force than necessary. "Don't tell me it was nothing. Don't tell me you're fine, because you are not fine. Caleb Morgan, you were shot protecting a widow's homestead from men who are apparently willing to kill to steal land, and I—" Her voice broke entirely. Now tears she'd been fighting back finally spilling over. "I don't know what I would have done if something had happened to you." Caleb caught her hand before she could pull away, his grip firm, despite the pain still etched across his face. "Eleanor, look at me." She did, eyes blurred with tears she couldn't quite stop, and found him watching her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "I'm alive," he said, "because you were smart enough to find that forged survey, because you were brave enough to ride out there with me instead of staying safe at the cabin, and because some part of me refused to let anything happen to you today. You didn't lose me, Eleanor. Not today. Not like this." "You promised me something," Eleanor said, gripping his hand back just as fiercely. "Anything. Promise me you won't do something so reckless again without thinking of what it would do to the people who—" She stopped herself before the word could fully form, throat tight with everything she wasn't yet brave enough to say. "Who what, Eleanor? Who care about you?" She finished the safer version of the truth, though something in Caleb's eyes told her he'd heard the fuller confession underneath it anyway. Outside, the storm had reached a fury that made the cabin walls groan under the strain, wind screaming down from the peaks with a violence that suggested this was no ordinary mountain squall, but something far more dangerous, and Eleanor found herself grateful, despite everything, that they'd made it back before it fully broke. "How bad is it?" she asked, glancing toward the shuttered window as another gust slammed against the cabin. "Bad," Caleb admitted. "Worst I've seen in years, and I've seen plenty. We're not going anywhere for at least a day, maybe two, till it passes." The realization settled between them, slowly trapped together, injured and isolated, with a conspiracy unfolding below them that had already turned violent, and nothing to do now but wait out a storm that seemed determined to bury the mountain entirely. Eleanor built up the fire while Caleb rested, his color still too pale for her liking, and she found herself watching him more than the flames, cataloging every small sign of pain he tried to hide, every shift of weight that favored his uninjured side. When she finally sat across from him, the ledger and evidence spread between them momentarily forgotten in favor of simple, exhausted relief that they'd both survived the day at all. Caleb spoke first. "Talbot said something," he said quietly, "before Whitfield's man got trigger-happy. Something I haven't been able to stop turning over since." "What did he say?" "Said the railroad's paying premium for consolidated acreage. Said if I sold now, quiet before the survey business got messy, they'd make it worth my while." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Said Hargrove already saw sense and I'd be wise to follow his example." Eleanor went very still. "Hargrove sold his land to them. That's what Talbot implied. Said Hargrove understood the way things were headed, understood a man alone couldn't fight a railroad and win, and got himself a fair price before the survey forced his hand anyway." Caleb studied her face carefully. "Eleanor, what if Hargrove wasn't just a man who rejected a bride he found unsuitable? What if the wife he ordered was never meant to actually stay?" The thought settled into Eleanor's chest like ice water pieces, rearranging themselves into a shape uglier than she'd initially imagined. "You think he ordered a mail-order bride specifically to reject her? I think a man selling his land quiet and fast doesn't want a wife asking questions about ledgers and boundary lines," Caleb said. "I think Talbot maybe suggested Hargrove find a reason to send you back before you settled in enough to notice anything, and rejecting you outright, cruel as it was, gave him an excuse that looked personal instead of calculated." Eleanor's hands curled into fists in her lap, fury rising hot and sharp beneath the horror of the realization. "You're saying my humiliation standing in that road while the whole town laughed might have been staged, might have been part of a scheme to keep me from ever looking closely at his books?" "I'm saying it fits the pattern too well to ignore," Caleb said gently. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know that's not an easy thing to hear." "No," Eleanor said, voice shaking with something that had shifted in the space of a few sentences from old shame into something far more dangerous. "It's not easy, but it's clarifying. Because if Hargrove rejected me, deliberately calculated it specifically to avoid scrutiny, then Talbot and Whitfield have been planning this scheme far longer and far more carefully than we realized. And it means Hargrove isn't just complicit Caleb. He's likely the one who told them exactly what kind of woman might see through their fraud in the first place. How would he know that?" "Because my letters," Eleanor said slowly, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. "In my correspondence with him before I ever traveled west, I mentioned keeping my father's mercantile ledgers. I mentioned it as a point of pride, something I thought would make me a more valuable wife to a rancher managing his own accounts. Caleb, I told him myself in writing exactly the skill that would have let me catch this fraud." Caleb's expression darkened further. "And once he had you standing in front of him, actually saw what marrying a sharp-eyed bookkeeper might mean for a man hiding fraudulent land dealings, he panicked," Eleanor finished. "Or he'd already decided based on my letters alone, long before I ever arrived, that I was a liability rather than an asset. The cruelty wasn't really about how I looked at all, Caleb. It was about making sure I left town too humiliated and too broken to ever think clearly enough to notice what was happening around me." The fire crackled between them, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite anger, though anger was certainly present, but something closer to a fierce, unshakable resolve. She had spent 5 days believing herself unwanted, unworthy too much, and not enough in equal measure. And now she understood that her rejection had never truly been about her at all. It had been about what she knew, what she could see, what her sharp mind and careful eye for numbers threatened to expose. "They made a mistake," she said quietly. "What's that?" "Talbot, Whitfield, Hargrove, all of them. They assumed a woman rejected and humiliated would simply disappear, go back east, fade into the kind of quiet shame that keeps women from ever speaking up about what was done to them." Eleanor's chin lifted that same stubborn tilt Caleb had come to recognize as entirely distinctly hers. "They didn't count on you stepping between me and that trading post crowd. They didn't count on a mountain man with 160 acres they needed, offering shelter to the one woman capable of unraveling their entire scheme." Caleb's expression, despite the pain still evident in the tight line of his shoulders, softened into something that looked remarkably like pride. "No," he agreed. "Reckon they didn't." The storm outside intensified through the evening wind, screaming louder against the cabin walls, and by the time full dark settled over the mountain, Eleanor understood they were facing something far more dangerous than an ordinary squall. The temperature had dropped precipitously, and despite the fire, the cold seemed to seep through every gap in the cabin's walls, and Caleb's fever, which she'd initially dismissed as simple exhaustion, had begun climbing steadily as the hours passed. "Caleb, you're burning up," she said, pressing a hand to his forehead. Sometime past midnight, alarm sharpening her voice. "Just tired," he mumbled, though his eyes had gone glassy in a way that frightened her considerably more than the wound itself. "That's not tired. That's fever, and it's getting worse." Eleanor moved quickly, soaking a cloth in the small basin of melted snow she'd set near the fire, pressing it against his forehead despite his weak protest. "The wound must be worse than we thought. Infection, perhaps, or something in the whiskey wasn't clean enough." "Fine," Caleb slurred, though his body swayed dangerously in the chair, and Eleanor caught him before he could tip forward entirely, her arm straining against his weight as she guided him toward the bed instead. "You are decidedly not fine," she said, fear sharpening into fierce focused determination as she worked to make him comfortable, checking the wound again by firelight, and finding it angrier, more swollen than it had been hours before. "Caleb, I need you to stay awake for me. Can you do that?" "Tired, Eleanor." I know you're tired, but I need you to talk to me. Keep your eyes open, because if you fall asleep with a fever this high, I don't know how to bring you back from it, and I refuse. I absolutely refuse to lose you to something as senseless as an infected bullet wound, after everything we've survived together this week." Something in her voice must have reached him, even through the fever's grip, because his eyes focused on her face with visible effort, and his hand found hers gripping weak but insistent. "Don't leave," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere," Eleanor promised, and meant it more completely than she'd meant almost anything in her life. The night stretched long and terrifying. Eleanor keeping the fire fed and the cloth cool against Caleb's fevered skin, talking to him steadily to keep him tethered to consciousness, even as his responses grew slower, more fragmented. Fever pulling him toward a dangerous, drifting sleep. She was determined not to let claim him. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said sometime in the deep hours before dawn, desperate for anything that might keep him present, keep him fighting. "Sarah, tell me something about her." Caleb's eyes, glassy with fever, found her face. "She used to sing," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Bad singer. Terrible, actually. But she didn't care. Sang anyway every morning making breakfast." "What did she sing?" "Don't remember the words. Just remember laughing at her, every single morning." His hand tightened weakly around Eleanor's. "Haven't laughed like that since." "You will again," Eleanor said fiercely, pressing the cool cloth against his forehead once more. "I promise you, Caleb Morgan, you will laugh like that again, but only if you fight this fever and stay with me tonight." "Why do you care so much?" Caleb murmured, fever loosening whatever guard usually kept his deeper thoughts private. What happens to a broken-down mountain man nobody else wanted to marry? Eleanor's breath caught, and in the fragile, exhausted darkness of that long night, she found herself answering with a truth she might never have voiced in daylight when pride and caution held her tongue more carefully. "Because you're the first person who ever looked at me and saw something worth keeping," she said softly. "Because when Hargrove called me a burden, you called me brave. Because you caught me at the edge of a cliff without hesitating, and you've been catching me ever since, in 100 smaller ways I don't think you even realize. I came west believing I'd find a husband who wanted a wife for what she could provide him. I never once imagined I'd find someone who wanted me simply because I was my self-size and stubbornness and sharp tongue included." "Eleanor, I'm not finished," she said, voice trembling now but steady in its resolve. "I didn't come west chasing some perfect romance, Caleb. I came because I wanted one chance, just one, where someone might choose me. Not because of what I could cook or clean or calculate. Simply because I was Eleanor. And that was supposed to be enough. Tears slipped down her cheeks, now unchecked exhaustion and fear and long-buried hope finally breaking free all at once. You are the first person who has ever made me believe that might actually be possible. Caleb's eyes, fever bright, but suddenly sharper, more present, held hers in the flickering firelight. Hargrove was a fool, he said, echoing his own words from days before, though this time his voice carried something far more raw, far more unguarded. Biggest fool this territory's ever seen, letting you go. You're delirious, Eleanor said, though her heart was hammering too hard for the words to carry any real doubt. Maybe, Caleb agreed. Don't make it less true. His eyes drifted shut. Then, exhaustion and fever finally pulling him under, despite her best efforts, and Eleanor sat beside him through the remaining hours of darkness. One hand pressed to his chest to feel the reassuring rhythm of his breathing. The other holding the cool cloth steady against his fevered skin, praying with an intensity she hadn't felt since her mother's final illness that she would not lose this man before she'd even had the chance to properly understand what he'd come to mean to her. Dawn broke gray and reluctant beyond the shuttered window, the storm finally beginning to loosen its grip on the mountain, and Eleanor felt Caleb's fever break sometime in those early hours, his skin cooling beneath her hand, his breathing settling into something deeper and more peaceful than the restless, fevered sleep of the night before. She allowed herself finally to weep silent, exhausted tears of relief that came without warning and without shame, her forehead resting against his good shoulder as the storm outside finally began to quiet. She didn't hear him wake. Eleanor! She startled upright, finding his eyes open clear now, fever gone, watching her with an expression that stole whatever words she might have offered. You stayed awake, he said. All night. I told you I wasn't going anywhere. Caleb's hand found hers again, stronger now, steadier, and he brought it slowly to his lips in a gesture so tender, so unlike the guarded man she'd first met outside Pruitt's trading post, that Eleanor's breath caught entirely in her throat. I heard you, he said quietly. Last night. Everything you said. Eleanor's cheeks flushed mortification and hope warring in equal measure. I thought you were delirious. Delirious enough to be honest, Caleb admitted. Not delirious enough to forget a single word of it. His thumb traced slow, gentle circles against her knuckles. Eleanor Whitaker, I have spent 6 years believing I didn't deserve to want anything again, that wanting always meant losing eventually. But I am done pretending I don't want you sitting across my table every morning, filling silence I didn't know how loud it had gotten until you started chasing it away. Eleanor's heart hammered so hard, she thought he must surely hear it. Caleb, let me finish, he said, voice rough but certain. Storm's breaking, which means Talbot and Whitfield and whatever they've got planned next is still waiting for us down that mountain. Which means this whatever's between us, it's gonna have to wait its turn behind justice for Mrs. Callahan and every other homesteader they've been stealing from. His eyes held her steady despite the vulnerability evident beneath them. But I need you to know before we ride back into whatever's waiting, that this ain't gratitude talking, and it ain't fever talking either. I want you here, Eleanor. Not for the winter, not until you find somewhere better to be. I want you here however long you'll have me. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, warm and terrifying and entirely unmistakably real, the exact opposite of the cold, hollow shame Hargrove had left her with beside that broken trunk. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt entirely, unquestionably wanted. I came west for one chance to be chosen, she whispered. I never imagined it might actually happen. It's happening. Caleb said, voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. Right now. Has been happening since you stood up to Pruitt over a fair price for a room you shouldn't have had to pay for at all. Outside, the wind had finally quieted to something almost peaceful. Weak morning light beginning to filter through the shuttered window, and Eleanor understood, sitting there with her hand held gently in Caleb's, that the storm's passing marked far more than simply the end of dangerous weather. But even as hope bloomed fragile and bright in her chest, a colder thought settled beneath it. Talbot and Whitfield were still out there, Still dangerous, still willing to shoot a man over a forged survey document. And somewhere below the mountain, Josiah Hargrove was likely already calculating his next move. Unaware that the woman he'd humiliated and discarded now held the exact evidence capable of destroying whatever fortune he'd built on other people's stolen land. The reckoning was coming, and neither Eleanor nor Caleb yet knew exactly how far Hargrove and his railroad partners were willing to go to stop it before it arrived. They rode down the mountain 3 days later, once the trail had cleared enough to be passable, and Eleanor could feel the change in Caleb beside her, not in his wound, which had healed clean once the fever broke, but in the set of his shoulders, the hard, focused resolve that had replaced the guarded solitude she'd first encountered outside Pruitt's trading post. "First stop's Mrs. Callahan's," Caleb said. "Need to know she's safe before we do anything else." "And then we ride for Denver," Caleb said. "Land office won't listen to accusations without proof, and even with proof, they might not listen to a mountain man and his—" He paused, glancing at her, something warm and uncertain crossing his face. "His partner alone. We need someone with standing in this territory willing to back our claim." "You have someone in mind." "Judge Abernathy," Caleb said. "Circuit judge rides through the territory twice a year. Man's got no patience for corruption, and he owes me a debt from years back I've never called in. If anyone can get the land office to actually investigate, instead of burying our evidence, it's him." They found Mrs. Callahan's homestead, quiet smoke rising steady from the chimney, and the old woman met them at her door, with visible relief, though her expression sobered quickly at the sight of them. "You look like you've been through the worst of it," she said, taking in Caleb's careful movements, the lingering paleness beneath his weathered skin. "Fever," Eleanor explained. "He's mending now." "Thanks to her," Caleb added, and something in the simple statement made Mrs. Callahan's sharp eyes move between them with obvious understanding. "Talbot's men came back once more," the old woman said. 2 days passed. Softer this time, no papers, no threats, just questions about whether I'd reconsidered their offer. I told them I hadn't reconsidered a single thing, and they left without much fuss. But I don't trust the quiet Caleb. Men like that don't give up easy. "They won't have the chance to try again," Caleb said. "We're riding for Denver. Judge Abernathy's circuit should have him in the territory capital within the week if the weather holds. We're bringing him everything: the forged survey, Eleanor's ledger analysis, the pattern across every homestead they've targeted." Mrs. Callahan's eyes went bright with something between hope and disbelief. "You truly think a judge will listen?" "I think a judge who's spent 30 years watching railroad money buy silence in this territory will jump at the chance to catch someone doing it clumsily enough to prove," Caleb said. "But I need you to write down everything that's happened, Mrs. Callahan. Every visit, every threat, every date you can remember. Your testimony matters as much as our numbers." The old woman nodded, already moving toward a small writing desk in the corner of her cabin, and Eleanor felt a fierce swell of pride watching her. A woman who'd been terrified and powerless just days before now, straightening her spine and taking up a pen with the same stubborn resolve Eleanor recognized from her own reflection. They stayed only long enough to gather Mrs. Callahan's written account, and then rode on toward Blackridge, the trading post town where Eleanor's humiliation had first begun less than 2 weeks before, though it felt somehow like an entirely different lifetime. The town looked the same weathered buildings, the same porch where Hargrove had ridden away and left her standing in the mud. But Eleanor felt entirely different walking through it now, no longer the discarded, humiliated woman who'd knelt in the frozen road gathering scattered belongings while strangers laughed. She walked beside Caleb with her chin lifted, evidence of fraud folded carefully in her satchel, purpose burning steady in her chest where shame had once lived. Pruitt's eyes widened slightly at the sight of them together. "Didn't expect you two back so soon." "Need supplies for a ride to Denver," Caleb said. "And information if you've got it. You seen Josiah Hargrove through here lately?" Something shifted in Pruitt's expression. Careful, guarded. "Matter of fact, he was through 2 days back. Bought passage on the eastbound stage." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "He's leaving the territory," Didn't say where he was headed exactly, Pruitt said. Just bought a ticket and left in a hurry. Struck me as odd man selling off cattle at half price right before he goes. He's running, Caleb said grimly, looking at Eleanor. Which means he knows something's coming or he's cutting his losses before Talbot's scheme collapses entirely. Or both, Eleanor said, mind already racing ahead. Caleb, if Hargrove leaves the territory before we can get testimony from him, we lose our clearest link between the railroad fraud and the mail-order bride scheme. He's the one who can confirm Talbot instructed him to reject me before I ever settled in enough to notice the ledgers. Stage doesn't leave till tomorrow morning. Pruitt offered unprompted something in his weathered face, suggesting he'd taken more interest in Eleanor's treatment than he'd initially let on. Staying at the boarding house 2 streets over if you're looking for him. Eleanor felt a fierce, unfamiliar thrill of purpose at the thought of confronting the man who'd humiliated her, who'd rejected her in front of an entire town for reasons that had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with protecting a fraud he'd helped orchestrate. I want to talk to him, she said. Eleanor. He owes me answers, Caleb. If nothing else before he disappears entirely, he owes me the truth about why he really sent me away. Caleb studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor watched him weigh his instinct to protect her against his growing understanding that she wasn't a woman who needed shielding from difficult confrontations. She was a woman who'd earned the right to face them on her own terms. I'm coming with you, he said finally. Not to speak for you. Just to make sure he doesn't try anything foolish when he realizes what you already know. They found Josiah Hargrove in the boarding house's small common room, a half-packed trunk beside him, his face going ashen the moment he looked up and saw Eleanor standing in the doorway. Eleanor, he said, voice unsteady. I didn't expect... No, Eleanor said, stepping into the room with a composure that surprised even herself. I don't imagine you expected to see me again at all, Mr. Hargrove. Leaving quite suddenly, aren't you? Business matters, Hargrove said, though his eyes darted toward Caleb, standing solid and silent behind her. And something in his expression suggested he understood exactly how thin that excuse sounded. Business matters, Eleanor repeated. Like the forged survey documents used to steal Mrs. Callahan's homestead. Like the falsified boundary records manipulating land values along the northern ridge before the railroad survey. Those business matters, Mr. Hargrove. Hargrove's face drained of what little color remained. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you know precisely what I'm talking about, Eleanor said, voice steady, despite the fury simmering beneath it. I think Talbot told you to find a reason to reject the wife you'd ordered before she settled in enough to notice your books didn't add up. I think you used my size, my appearance as an excuse that looked personal instead of calculated, because the truth that you were protecting a fraud scheme, worth far more than any wife's companionship, wouldn't have played nearly so well in front of a watching town. That's not... Hargrove started, then stopped, something breaking behind his carefully guarded expression. You don't understand the position I was in. Then explain it to me, Eleanor said. Explain why a man desperate enough to sell his cattle at half price and flee the territory in the dead of winter would spend his final days here manufacturing an excuse to humiliate a woman in front of an entire town rather than simply telling her the truth. Hargrove's shoulders sagged. Whatever remaining defiance he'd been holding on to, finally collapsing under the weight of Eleanor's steady, unrelenting gaze. Talbot came to me 8 months ago, he said quietly. Told me the railroad wanted my acreage. Told me a wife complicated negotiations, made bachelor claims harder to consolidate quietly. Said if I found a reason to send you back before you settled into the community, before you started asking questions about anything, it'd be cleaner for everyone. Cleaner for everyone except me, Eleanor said, voice tight. I'm not proud of it, Hargrove admitted. But Talbot's not a man you say no to easily, not once you're already tangled up with him. I'd taken money already. Eleanor advanced payment for my land contingent on keeping things quiet till the survey went through official channels. Rejecting you was the price of getting out clean. Getting out clean, Eleanor repeated, disbelief and anger warring in her voice. You call what you did to me clean. You humiliated me in front of an entire town, called me a burden in front of strangers, left me standing in the road with nowhere to go, all so you could collect payment for land you'd already agreed to sell fraudulently. "I'm sorry," Hargrove said. And for the first time, something in his voice sounded genuinely broken rather than merely defensive. "I've regretted it since the moment I rode away. But I was already in too deep with Talbot by then. Man's got connections that reach further than the territorial land office, Eleanor. I was frightened of what backing out might cost me." Caleb stepped forward, then voice hard as stone. "Frightened enough to let good, honest homesteaders lose their land to a scheme you helped hide." Hargrove flinched at the accusation, but didn't deny it. "What do you want from me?" "Testimony," Eleanor said. "Written and signed, detailing exactly what Talbot told you, exactly what payment you accepted, exactly how this scheme operates. We're riding for Denver to present evidence to Judge Abernathy. Your account could be the difference between Talbot facing real consequences or simply relocating his fraud to the next territory once this one gets too hot for him." Hargrove was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Eleanor could only partially guess at: fear of Talbot's reach, perhaps, or some final flickering remnant of conscience finally surfacing after months of complicity. "If I testify," he said slowly, "Talbot won't let that go unanswered. Man's dangerous, Eleanor. More dangerous than either of you seem to fully understand." "We understand plenty," Caleb said. "Man already put a bullet in my shoulder over a forged survey document. I don't figure his danger's a mystery to either of us." Hargrove's eyes moved between them, something shifting in his expression as he seemed to finally register the full weight of what he'd set into motion, not just Eleanor's humiliation, but violence, theft, an entire scheme built on stolen land and manufactured lies. "All right," he said finally. "I'll write it down, everything. God knows I owe you that much, Eleanor, and considerably more besides." He wrote for nearly an hour, while Eleanor and Caleb waited, his hand growing steadier as the confession poured out onto the page: dates, payments, Talbot's exact instructions, the names of at least 3 other homesteaders beyond the ones they'd already identified, whose land had been similarly targeted. When he finally finished signing his name at the bottom with a hand that trembled slightly, he looked up at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't expected, something close to genuine remorse. "For what it's worth," he said. "And I understand it's likely worth very little. At this point, I was wrong about you, Eleanor. The letters you sent before you traveled west, you wrote about your father's ledgers, like it was something you were proud of, and I remember thinking even then that a man would be a fool not to value a wife with that kind of mind." His eyes flickered briefly toward Caleb. "Seems like someone finally had the sense to see it." Eleanor took the folded confession from his hands, her fingers steady, despite the storm of emotion still churning beneath her composed exterior. "Goodbye, Mr. Hargrove. I hope wherever you're running to, you find enough courage to stop running eventually." They left him there, packing his trunk with hands that shook, and Eleanor didn't look back as they walked out of the boarding house into the cold afternoon air. "You did well in there," Caleb said quietly once they were outside. "Better than well. I don't know many folks who could have faced the man who humiliated them and come away with a signed confession instead of just satisfaction." "I didn't want satisfaction," Eleanor said. "I wanted justice. There's a difference, and I think I only understood that difference clearly once I met you." Caleb's hand found hers steady and warm despite the winter chill, and they walked together toward the stable where their horses waited, evidence-gathered path toward Denver now clear before them. The ride to Denver took the better part of 3 days, the weather holding cold but clear, and Eleanor found herself growing more confident with each mile, not just in the strength of their evidence, but in the strange, unfamiliar sense of partnership that had grown between them through danger, through fever, through the raw honesty of that long night when Caleb's guard had finally completely fallen. They found Judge Abernathy on the second evening in Denver, holding court in a modest office near the Territorial Land Registry, a stern-faced man in his 60s whose sharp eyes studied Eleanor's carefully organized evidence with obvious growing interest. "This is thorough work," he said, flipping through the ledger pages. Eleanor had prepared cross-referenced dates and forged survey comparisons laid out with meticulous clarity. "Unusually thorough for evidence brought by a homesteader rather than a trained accountant. I kept my father's mercantile books for 6 years. Your Honor," Eleanor said, "fraud has a particular shape to it once you know how to look." Abernathy's sharp eyes moved to her with new interest. And you found this pattern yourself? With Mr. Morgan's cooperation, yes. And Mrs. Callahan's testimony, and Mr. Hargrove's confession, which I believe you'll find particularly damning, given his direct involvement in the scheme's execution. Abernathy read through Hargrove's signed statement in silence, his expression growing steadily darker, and when he finally looked up, something had hardened in his weathered face. I've suspected corruption along that railroad survey for over a year, he said. Never had proof solid enough to act on. This, he tapped the stack of evidence. This is solid enough. Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly her knees nearly buckled, weeks of fear and exhaustion finally finding release. You'll investigate, Caleb asked. I'll do more than investigate, Abernathy said. I'll issue warrants for Talbot and Whitfield's arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted theft of homestead land effective immediately. I'll also be sending riders to halt any further railroad survey activity in that region until a proper, honest survey can be conducted. His eyes moved to Caleb's bandaged shoulder. And given that Mr. Whitfield's associate apparently shot you, Mr. Morgan, I'd say we've got grounds for attempted murder charges as well, should we manage to apprehend the man responsible. They'll run, Caleb said. Talbot's not the type to wait around for a warrant. Then we'd best move quickly, Abernathy said, already rising from his desk. I'll deputize riders tonight. We ride for Blackridge at first light. That night in the small boarding house room Caleb had secured for them in Denver, separate rooms, though Eleanor found herself lying awake far longer than sleep required. Thinking of him just down the hall, she allowed herself finally to feel the full weight of everything they'd survived. The humiliation at the trading post, the wolf, the gunfight, Caleb's fever the long night she'd feared losing him entirely. And now finally something that felt dangerously, wonderfully close to victory. She thought of Hargrove's parting words. Someone finally had the sense to see it, and felt something warm bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with vindication, and everything to do with the way Caleb Morgan had looked at her since that very first day outside Pruitt's trading post, like she was something worth protecting, worth valuing, worth choosing. The ride back to Blackridge carried an urgency that hadn't existed on the journey to Denver. Judge Abernathy and 4 deputized riders moving fast through the winter landscape. Evidence, secured warrants, signed justice finally tangibly within reach. They reached the trading post as evening settled over the mountains, and the scene that greeted them stopped Eleanor's heart cold. Talbot and Whitfield stood on Pruitt's porch, saddlebags, packed horses, ready, clearly preparing to flee exactly as Caleb had predicted. But it wasn't their obvious departure that made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was the third figure standing beside them, rifle raised, aimed directly at the approaching riders. That's far enough, the man said, one of Whitfield's hired guns, the same nervous energy from the confrontation at Mrs. Callahan's homestead, now sharpened into something considerably more dangerous. Lower that weapon, Judge Abernathy commanded, voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. You're interfering with a lawful arrest. Lawful arrest for what? Talbot called out, though his composed drawl had frayed considerably at the edges. You've got no proof of anything, Judge. Word of a woman and a mountain man against the word of a legitimate railroad survey. I've got Hargrove's signed confession, Abernathy said. I've got forged documents with backdated survey signatures. I've got 7 homesteaders worth of falsified boundary records, and I've got a witness willing to testify you shot Caleb Morgan on Mrs. Callahan's property. That's more than enough proof, Talbot, and you know it. Talbot's face went pale, calculation flickering visible behind his eyes as he weighed his rapidly narrowing options. Whitfield, he said quietly. Get the horses. Nobody's leaving, Caleb said, his own rifle already in hand, though Eleanor noticed his shoulder, still favored the injury, still moved with careful restraint, despite the tension crackling through the air. Caleb, don't, Eleanor said, fear spiking sharp and sudden in her chest as she recognized the same reckless courage that had put him in danger once already. But it was the hired gun who moved first. Panic overtaking caution as he swung his rifle toward Caleb, and Eleanor's scream tore from her throat before she'd even consciously decided to move her body, already lunging forward without thought, without calculation, driven by nothing but pure desperate instinct to protect the man who had spent 2 weeks protecting her. The shot cracked across the frozen air. But it wasn't Caleb who'd been the target after all. One of Abernathy's deputized riders had fired first faster, more experienced than the panicked gunman, and the hired shooter crumpled with a cry. Rifle clattering uselessly to the porch boards. Silence fell heavy and absolute across the trading post, broken only by the wounded man's ragged breathing and the distant, frightened whinny of a startled horse. "Enough," Abernathy said into that silence voice carrying absolute authority. "Talbot, Whitfield, you're both under arrest. Anyone else foolish enough to raise a weapon will join your associate on the ground." Talbot's shoulders sagged, whatever remaining fight had been sustaining him finally draining away entirely. "This isn't finished," he said, though the threat carried little weight beneath his obvious defeat. "Railroads got lawyers, got money, got a signed confession from your own accomplice," Abernathy cut in flatly. "And enough documented fraud to keep territorial courts occupied for the better part of a year. Save your threats for your legal counsel, Mr. Talbot. You'll need them considerably more than I do." Deputies moved forward to secure Talbot and Whitfield, and Eleanor found herself trembling now that the danger had passed, adrenaline draining away, and leaving something shaky and overwhelmed in its wake. Caleb was beside her instantly, his good arm wrapping around her shoulders, steadying her the way he'd steadied her on that first treacherous climb up the mountain trail. "You could have been killed," Eleanor said, voice unsteady. "Lunging forward like that without thinking. Reckon I could say the same about you?" Caleb said gently. "Screaming loud enough to distract a man aiming a rifle at me when you had no earthly idea whether that scream might have gotten you shot instead." "I couldn't just stand there," Eleanor said. "Not while someone aimed a weapon at you." "Nor could I," Caleb said, "which is precisely why I moved when I did." He tilted her chin up gently, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Seems we've both got a habit of leaping toward danger for each other without much regard for our own safety." "That seems a poor habit to encourage," Eleanor said, though her voice had softened considerably. "Maybe," Caleb agreed. "Or maybe it's just what happens when two people finally find someone worth that kind of risk." The trading post around them slowly settled back into ordinary motion. Deputies loading Talbot and Whitfield onto horses for the ride back to Denver Pruitt, watching from his doorway with an expression that suggested he was rapidly reassessing every assumption he'd made about the woman he'd nearly refused shelter 2 weeks before. Word spread through Blackridge faster even than Eleanor's initial humiliation had spread on that first terrible day. Not gossip about a rejected mail-order bride, but genuine astonished admiration for the woman who'd uncovered a railroad fraud scheme that had been quietly stealing land from vulnerable homesteaders for the better part of a year. Mrs. Pruitt approached Eleanor that evening, her earlier pitying tone entirely absent, now replaced by something that bordered on awe. "I heard what you did, dear. Found forged documents exposed the whole scheme. Never would have imagined it that first day you arrived." "Nor would I," Eleanor admitted honestly. "Hargrove's loss is certainly this territory's gain," Mrs. Pruitt continued. "Man's a fool letting a mind like yours get away from him over something as foolish as appearance." Eleanor found she no longer needed to defend herself against such comments. No longer felt the old familiar shame rise up at the mention of Hargrove's rejection. Instead, she felt something close to gratitude. Because his cruelty, however calculated and cowardly its true motivation had led her directly to Caleb Morgan's door to a partnership and a purpose she never would have found waiting quietly back in Illinois for a husband who valued her only for what she could provide. That night, back at the small cabin they'd shared through storm and fever and danger, Caleb built up the fire while Eleanor unpacked the last of their traveling supplies, both of them moving with the loose, exhausted relief of people who'd survived something far larger than either had expected when this journey first began. "It's over," Eleanor said quietly, settling onto the floor near the fire, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything they'd accomplished. "Talbot and Whitfield are under arrest. Mrs. Callahan's land is safe. The homesteaders along that ridge will get their fraudulent survey records overturned." "Because of you," Caleb said, settling beside her close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Because of us," Eleanor corrected gently. I could have found every fraudulent number in that ledger, and it wouldn't have mattered without you standing beside me, defending Mrs. Callahan's homestead, riding through a blizzard believing in what I'd found, even when it put you directly in danger's path." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability Eleanor had come to recognize as rare precious, offered only in moments he trusted completely. "I spent 6 years telling myself I didn't need anyone," he said. "Told myself solitude was simpler, safer, that caring about something just meant eventually losing it." He turned to look at her firelight, catching the rare softness in his pale eyes. "You walked into my life 2 weeks ago, rejected and humiliated by a man too foolish to see what he was losing, and somehow in a matter of days, you became the person I can't imagine this cabin without." "Caleb, I know it's fast," he continued. "I know 2 weeks ain't near long enough for most folks to know their own hearts. But I've had 6 years of knowing exactly what loneliness feels like, Eleanor, and I know precisely what its absence feels like too, now that you've filled it. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, but I need you to know this ain't temporary. This ain't just till spring or till you find somewhere better to be. I want you here, however long you'll stay." Eleanor felt tears gather, warm and unashamed, entirely different from the humiliated tears she'd shed beside her broken trunk 2 weeks before. "I came west chasing one chance to be chosen," she said softly, echoing words she'd spoken to him once before, in fever-lit darkness. She'd worried he might not remember. "I found something far better than I ever imagined possible. I found someone who chose me, not despite everything I am, but entirely because of it." Caleb's hand found hers, and this time neither of them pulled away. Neither of them hesitated behind protective walls or careful restraint. "Stay," he said simply. "Not for the winter. Not until spring gives you an easier road out. Stay, because this is where you belong. Eleanor Whitaker, and I am done pretending I don't want that with my whole heart." "I'm staying," Eleanor said, and the words felt like the truest thing she'd ever spoken. "Not out of gratitude, not out of fear of what waits for me elsewhere. I'm staying because somewhere between that first terrible day at Pruitt's trading post and this fire tonight, I fell in love with a mountain man who taught me that being too much was never actually my flaw at all." Caleb's hand rose to cup her face, gentle, despite the roughness of years spent surviving alone on this unforgiving mountain, and when he finally closed the distance between them, the kiss carried none of the desperate uncertainty of new beginnings, but instead something steadier, more certain, the culmination of 2 weeks spent proving through danger and fever and quiet fire, lit conversations exactly what kind of partnership they were building together. Outside, the mountain settled into peaceful winter silence. The storm long passed, the danger finally resolved, and Eleanor understood, held close in Caleb Morgan's arms before a fire that had once burned only for one lonely man, that Hargrove's cruel rejection had never been an ending at all. It had been, however painfully, the beginning of everything she'd never known to hope for. But even as warmth and certainty settled into her chest, Eleanor understood their fight wasn't entirely finished. Talbot and Whitfield's arrest would bring trial testimony, the difficult work of ensuring justice actually held once railroad money and legal maneuvering entered the equation. Homesteaders across the territory would need help reclaiming what had been stolen from them. And somewhere beyond the mountain, the wider consequences of what they'd exposed were only just beginning to unfold. Consequences that would test in ways neither of them yet anticipated. Exactly how far they were willing to go to protect what they'd built together on this lonely, beautiful mountain they now finally both called home. Morning brought a stillness Eleanor hadn't felt since before Hargrove's cruel rejection first split her life into before and after. She woke wrapped in Caleb's arm. The fire burned low but steady, and for a long moment she simply lay there listening to his breathing, memorizing the particular warmth of belonging somewhere at last. "You're staring," Caleb murmured, eyes still closed. "I'm remembering," Eleanor said. 2 weeks ago, I woke up in a stranger's back room at Pruitt's trading post, certain I had nothing left and nowhere to go." Caleb's eyes opened, finding hers in the pale morning light. "And now I'm not certain of much," Eleanor admitted, "except that I never want to wake up anywhere else again. He kissed her forehead slow and unhurried, and for a few precious minutes, the world beyond the cabin walls didn't exist at all. No Talbot, no trial, no railroad scheme still unraveling somewhere below the mountain. Just the two of them, and a fire, and a certainty that had grown roots faster than either of them had thought possible. It was the sound of a rider approaching that broke the peace. Urgent hoofbeats cutting through the quiet, and Caleb was up and reaching for his rifle before Eleanor had even fully registered the noise. "Easy," he said, glancing through the window. "It's one of Abernathy's deputies." The young deputy, breathless and windburned from a hard ride, delivered his message standing in the cabin doorway. "Judge wanted you informed directly, Mr. Morgan. Talbot's hired lawyers from Denver already, filing motions to have the evidence thrown out claiming it was obtained through trespass and coercion." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Coercion? We didn't coerce anyone." "Lawyers don't need truth, ma'am," the deputy said apologetically. "Just need doubt enough to muddy things. Judge says the trial's set for 2 weeks out, and he wants both of you present to testify. Says your evidence is solid, but Talbot's counsel will try to make it look otherwise if you're not there to defend it directly." "We'll be there," Caleb said. The deputy nodded and turned to go, then paused, glancing back with something like admiration on his young face. "For what it's worth, ma'am, whole territories talking about what you found. Never seen fraud like that unraveled so clean. Judge says you've got a mind for numbers sharper than most attorneys he's known." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused still to praise that landed as fact rather than flattery. "Thank you for saying so." Once the deputy rode off, Eleanor turned to Caleb, unease settling behind her ribs. 2 weeks isn't much time to prepare a defense against lawyers who do this professionally." "No," Caleb agreed. "But it's plenty of time for us to make certain our evidence holds together tighter than anything their lawyers can pull apart. You built that case once, Eleanor. You can build it stronger." They spent the following days doing exactly that. Eleanor cross-referencing every document a second time, a third time, anticipating every angle a defense attorney might use to sow doubt. She wrote to Mrs. Callahan requesting additional detail on dates and conversations. She rode with Caleb to 2 other homesteads along the ridge, gathering testimony from families who'd received similar threats, building a chorus of witnesses too large and too consistent for any lawyer to dismiss as coincidence or grudge. It was on the 5th day, while organizing testimony at the kitchen table, that a knock sounded at the cabin door, unexpected, unfamiliar, and immediately alarming, given how few visitors ever found their way up that mountain trail uninvited. Caleb answered, rifle never far from his hand these days, and Eleanor watched his posture shift from wary to something more complicated as a well-dressed stranger removed his hat and offered a polite, careful smile. "Mr. Morgan, Miss Whitaker, I presume." The man's voice carried the smooth, practiced cadence of someone accustomed to negotiation. "My name is Reginald Voss. I represent the Continental Western Railroad Company." "We've got nothing to discuss with the railroad," Caleb said flatly. "On the contrary, I believe we've got a great deal to discuss." Voss said, "Given that my company has just learned 2 of its contracted land agents have apparently been operating a fraud scheme entirely without corporate knowledge or sanction." "Without corporate knowledge," Eleanor repeated, skepticism sharp in her voice. "You'll forgive me for finding that difficult to believe, Mr. Voss, given the scale of the fraud and the money involved." Voss's smile tightened fractionally. "I understand your skepticism, Miss Whitaker. I've come to offer proof of good faith. My company wishes to distance itself entirely from Talbot and Whitfield's actions, and to that end we're prepared to offer generous compensation to every homesteader affected, full restoration of stolen acreage, plus damages for the distress caused." "That's remarkably generous," Caleb said, voice edged with suspicion. "For a company that just discovered its own employees defrauding an entire mountain ridge." "We prefer to resolve matters quietly," Voss admitted, some of the Polish slipping from his tone. "Public trials are unpredictable, costly to reputation regardless of outcome." Eleanor felt the shape of the offer settle into place with sudden sickening clarity. "You want us to withdraw our testimony. I want us to reach a solution that serves everyone's interests," Voss said carefully. The homesteaders received their land and compensation without the delay and expense of a lengthy trial. My company avoids costly public scrutiny. And you both—" his eyes moved between them meaningfully. "You both receive a considerable personal settlement more than generous enough to secure this cabin's future for decades to come." "You're offering us a bribe," Eleanor said, disbelief sharpening into fury. "I'm offering a business solution," Voss corrected smoothly. "Get off my land," Caleb said, voice gone cold and flat, in a way Eleanor recognized from that very first day outside Pruitt's trading post. "Mr. Morgan, I'd encourage you to consider carefully before—" "I said, get off my land," Caleb repeated, and something in his stillness carried more threat than any raised voice could have managed. "You want to make amends to the homesteaders your company robbed. You can do that in open court in front of Judge Abernathy, same as everyone else answering for this scheme. We're not selling our testimony for a settlement designed to keep your railroad's name out of the papers." Voss studied them both for a long moment, calculation flickering behind his careful expression, and finally replaced his hat with the resigned air of a man accustomed to negotiations that didn't always go his way. "You understand this changes nothing about the trial's difficulty," he said, tone cooling considerably. "My company's lawyers will still mount a vigorous defense of our institutional interests, whatever role Talbot and Whitfield played independently." "We understand," Eleanor said. "We're prepared for it." Once Voss rode off, Eleanor sank into a chair, hands trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. They're going to fight this every step of the way, aren't they? Not just Talbot and Whitfield, but the entire railroad company with all its money and all its lawyers. "Probably," Caleb admitted, sitting across from her. "But you built a case too solid for money to simply erase Eleanor. Forged documents don't stop being forged just because a company offers a settlement. Mrs. Callahan's stolen land doesn't become legally hers, less unjustly, just because Voss wants to avoid a trial." "I know," Eleanor said. I hadn't realized how much bigger this was than Talbot and Whitfield alone. An entire railroad company willing to offer bribes rather than face accountability." "Then we make certain accountability finds them anyway," Caleb said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You didn't come this far, survive everything you've survived to back down now, because the fight got bigger than you expected." Eleanor squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty, even as her own resolve steadied beneath it. "No," she agreed. "I didn't." The 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, and when they finally rode into Denver for the trial, Eleanor felt a different kind of nervousness than she'd carried into that boarding house confrontation with Hargrove. Not fear of humiliation, but the weight of knowing that Mrs. Callahan and half a dozen other homesteaders were counting on the evidence she'd built to hold under pressure neither of them had fully anticipated. The courtroom was crowded. The morning the trial began, word of the scheme having spread far beyond Black Ridge, curious townspeople and concerned homesteaders filling every available seat. Talbot sat beside 2 sharply dressed lawyers, his earlier arrogance replaced by careful, calculated composure, while Whitfield beside him looked considerably less composed, sweat visible on his brow, despite the courtroom's winter chill. Judge Abernathy presided with the same stern authority Eleanor had witnessed in his office weeks before, and when the prosecuting attorney called Eleanor to testify, she rose with a steadiness that surprised even herself, walking to the witness stand beneath the weight of dozens of watching eyes without once letting her chin drop. "Miss Whitaker," the prosecutor began, "can you describe for the court how you first discovered irregularities in the survey documents?" Eleanor answered clearly, methodically, walking the court through the ledger discrepancies, the forged dates, the pattern of targeted homesteaders too vulnerable to fight back the same careful evidence-based reasoning that had first caught Silas Boone's cheating weeks before this scheme had ever crossed her path. When Talbot's lawyer rose for cross-examination, Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, bracing herself for whatever attack he intended. "Miss Whitaker," the lawyer began, tone deceptively pleasant, "isn't it true that you arrived in this territory as a rejected mail-order bride, humiliated publicly by Mr. Hargrove?" Eleanor felt the courtroom's attention sharpen, felt old shame threaten to rise despite everything she'd survived since that terrible day. "That's true." And isn't it also true that shortly after this humiliation, you began living with Mr. Morgan, unmarried, in his mountain cabin? That's also true, Eleanor said, voice steady despite the deliberate insinuation threading through the question. Would you agree, Miss Whitaker, that a woman recently rejected and humiliated might be inclined toward exaggeration, or even fabrication, in pursuit of validation? Perhaps eager to prove her worth through dramatic accusations against powerful men. The courtroom murmured, and Eleanor felt fury rise hot and sharp beneath her carefully maintained composure. But instead of letting it crack her voice, she let it sharpen it instead. I'd agree, sir, that a woman recently humiliated might be tempted toward exactly that, she said, which is precisely why I didn't rely on feeling or grievance or wounded pride to build this case. I relied on numbers, dates, signatures that don't match the surveys they claim to represent. A forged filing date 8 months removed from when the document claims to have been created. Mrs. Callahan's sworn testimony that no surveyor ever actually visited her property. Mr. Hargrove's own signed confession detailing exactly how Mr. Talbot instructed him to reject me specifically to avoid scrutiny of his books. Her eyes held the lawyer's steadily. I'd invite you, sir, to find the exaggeration in a backdated document or the fabrication in 7 separate homesteaders describing an identical pattern of threats and forged paperwork. Numbers don't care whether the person reading them was recently humiliated. They simply are what they are. Doy. A ripple of quiet approval moved through the courtroom, and Eleanor watched Talbot's lawyer's confident expression falter slightly under the weight of an answer he clearly hadn't anticipated. No further questions, he said, finally retreating to his table with considerably less composure than he'd approached with. Judge Abernathy's eyes met Eleanor's briefly as she stepped down from the witness stand, and though his expression remained appropriately neutral for the bench, something in it suggested approval he wasn't permitted to voice aloud. Caleb testified next, his account of the shooting at Mrs. Callahan's homestead, delivered with the same flat, unshakable certainty he brought to everything. And when Talbot's lawyer attempted to suggest the shooting had been accidental, provoked by Caleb's own aggressive posture, Caleb's response left little room for doubt. Man aimed a rifle at me after I told him the survey he was defending was forged, Caleb said. Ain't much accidental about pulling a trigger, sir. Bullet found my shoulder because his aim was true, not because I gave him reason beyond speaking an inconvenient truth out loud. The trial stretched across 3 difficult days, witness after witness, describing the same pattern of threats and forged documents, Talbot's lawyers working every possible angle to introduce doubt, to shift blame, to paint the scheme as isolated incidents, rather than systematic fraud. But Eleanor's evidence held tested and retested under hostile questioning, and by the 3rd day, even the railroad's own representative, called reluctantly to testify about corporate knowledge of the scheme, struggled to maintain the fiction of complete ignorance under careful pointed questioning about approved budget allocations that seemed remarkably specific for supposedly unauthorized fraud. The verdict, when it finally came, brought Eleanor to tears. She didn't bother hiding guilty on all counts for both Talbot and Whitfield, with sentencing to follow, and a formal order requiring the railroad company to restore every fraudulently claimed parcel of land to its rightful homesteaders, plus damages for the distress and financial harm caused. Mrs. Callahan, seated in the courtroom gallery throughout the entire trial, wept openly at the verdict, and when Eleanor found her afterward in the courthouse hallway, the old woman pulled her into an embrace, fierce enough to steal her breath. "You saved my home," Mrs. Callahan said, voice thick with emotion. "Saved it, and half this territory besides. I don't know how to thank you properly, child." "You don't need to thank me," Eleanor said, holding the embrace just as tightly. "You just need to keep living on that land you fought so hard to keep." Judge Abernathy approached as the crowd began dispersing, offering Caleb a firm handshake and Eleanor a nod of genuine respect. "Fine work, both of you. This territory owes you considerably more than gratitude, though I suspect gratitude's what you'll receive most abundantly in the coming weeks." He wasn't wrong. Word of the trial's outcome spread through the territory faster than Eleanor's initial humiliation ever had, and by the time they returned to Blackridge, something had shifted fundamentally in how the town regarded her. Where strangers had once whispered pitying judgments about her size and her rejection, they now approached with open admiration, with genuine curiosity about the woman who'd uncovered fraud that had been quietly stealing land for the better part of a year. Pruitt himself, once reluctant to even offer her a room, now greeted her with something approaching reverence. Miss Whitaker. Heard the verdict, came back guilty on every count. Whole territories talking about it. We were fortunate to have solid evidence, Eleanor said. Though she'd grown considerably more comfortable accepting recognition she'd once have deflected entirely. Fortunate my foot, Pruitt said, uncharacteristically warm. Took sharp eyes and considerable courage to see what you saw, and considerable nerve to chase it all the way to a Denver courtroom. This territory's better for having you in it, ma'am, whatever Hargrove was too blind to appreciate. Eleanor felt something settle deep in her chest at his words. Not vindication exactly, though there was certainly satisfaction in watching a town that had laughed at her humiliation now speak her name with respect. It was something closer to belonging. The particular warmth of finally being seen, not despite her differences, but because of the strength those very differences had provided. The homesteaders, whose land had been fraudulently claimed, began the slow process of reclaiming their property in the weeks that followed, and Eleanor found herself drawn into helping several of them navigate the paperwork required to formalize the restoration work that came naturally to her work, that filled her days with a purpose she'd never imagined finding when she'd first boarded that stagecoach, believing she was traveling toward nothing more than marriage and domestic obligation. Mrs. Callahan in particular took to visiting the cabin regularly, ostensibly to thank Eleanor again for saving her homestead, though Eleanor suspected the older woman had simply grown fond of company after years of isolated widowhood. "You've got a gift, dear," Mrs. Callahan said one afternoon, watching Eleanor help a young homesteading family untangle a confusing set of restored property documents. Not just with numbers, with people too. You listen to what folks are actually afraid of underneath all their confused paperwork, and you help them see their way through it. "I suppose I understand what it feels like," Eleanor said, "to have your future depend on documents you don't fully understand, controlled by people who don't have your best interests at heart." "Suppose you do," Mrs. Callahan agreed. "Makes for a rare kind of compassion, that understanding. Rarer still, someone willing to use it helping others instead of just protecting themselves." That evening, once Mrs. Callahan had departed and the cabin had settled into its familiar evening quiet, Eleanor found Caleb sitting near the hearth. Something contemplative in his expression that she'd learned over the past weeks usually preceded words he'd been carefully considering. "You've built something here," he said, watching her set the table for supper with the same practiced ease she'd shown from her very first night in this cabin. "Not just solving the fraud, though that alone would have been considerable. You've built a place for yourself in this community. Folks respect you now, Eleanor. Genuinely respect you, not just for what you uncovered, but for who you are." "I couldn't have found any of it without you," Eleanor said. "Without you offering shelter that first day, without you believing my theory about the boundary records, when it would have been easier to dismiss it." "Maybe," Caleb allowed. "But the courage to chase that theory all the way to a Denver courtroom, the compassion to keep helping homesteaders untangle their restored property long after the trial ended, that's entirely yours, Eleanor. I just happened to be standing nearby when you decided to become exactly who you were always meant to be." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she crossed the small distance between them, settling into the space beside him near the fire that had become as familiar and comforting as anything she'd ever known. "I used to think," she said softly, "that Hargrove's rejection was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Standing in that road listening to the whole town laugh, believing I was too much and not enough all at once." She paused, gathering the words carefully. "Now I understand it was actually the moment my life finally started making sense. If he'd married me, if I'd simply become the quiet, dutiful wife he expected, I never would have found any of this. I never would have found you." Caleb's hand found hers, thumb tracing slow circles against her knuckles in the gesture that had become achingly familiar over the past weeks. "Reckon that makes Hargrove the most foolish man in this entire territory," he said, rejecting the one thing that would have actually made his life better and handing it instead straight to a lonely mountain man who didn't know how badly he needed exactly what he was getting. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the fire crackling steady between them, and Eleanor found herself thinking of everything that had unfolded since that terrible day at Pruitt's trading post. The wolf, the fever, the storm, the trial. And through it all, the slow, steady building of something she'd never once expected to find on a mail-order journey she'd undertaken purely out of desperation. It was nearly a month later, with spring finally beginning to soften the mountain's harsh edges, that Caleb approached her one evening with a nervousness entirely unlike his usual steady certainty. "Eleanor," he said, "I've been thinking about something. Thinking on it for weeks now, if I'm honest, though. I've been waiting for the right moment to say it properly." Eleanor set down the mending she'd been working on, sensing something significant building beneath his careful words. "What is it, Caleb?" He reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a small object wrapped carefully in soft leather, and Eleanor's heart began hammering before he'd even fully unwrapped it. "This was my mother's," he said, revealing a simple gold ring worn smooth with age but clearly cherished. "Before it was Sarah's. I put it away after she passed, figured I'd never have reason to bring it out again. Figured that part of my life was finished." His eyes found Eleanor's steady despite the vulnerability evident beneath them. "Then a stranger walked into my life, rejected by a fool who never deserved her, and somehow, in a matter of weeks, she became the reason this cabin feels like a home again, instead of just a place to survive winter." Eleanor's breath caught entirely, tears already gathering as she understood exactly what was unfolding. "I love you, Eleanor Whitaker," Caleb continued, voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. "Not because you saved Mrs. Callahan's homestead, though that matters plenty. Not because you're the sharpest mind I've ever known, though that matters too. I love you because you looked at a lonely, broken mountain man who'd convinced himself he didn't deserve happiness, and you decided to stay anyway. You decided I was worth choosing, same as I decided you were worth choosing, right from that very first day outside Pruitt's trading post." He knelt then, ring held carefully between his weathered fingers, and Eleanor felt the entire weight of everything she'd survived, the humiliation, the rejection, the long, lonely years of being told she was too much and not enough, finally completely dissolve into something warm and certain and entirely unmistakably real. "Will you marry me?" Caleb asked. "Not because you've got nowhere else to go, not because it's convenient or practical. Because I love you, and I want to spend whatever years I've got left proving that Hargrove was the biggest fool this territory's ever produced." "Yes." Eleanor said the word, emerging on a broken, joyful laugh, even as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Caleb Morgan, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, despite their usual steadiness, and when he rose to pull her into his arms, Eleanor felt the last remaining shadow of Hargrove's cruel rejection finally completely lift from her chest, replaced entirely by a happiness so complete it left her breathless. They married 3 weeks later, a small ceremony held at Mrs. Callahan's homestead, with the entire community in attendance. Pruitt and his wife, the young deputy who'd first brought news of the trial date, half a dozen homesteaders whose land Eleanor had helped restore, all gathered to witness a union that had begun improbably with a humiliating rejection at a mountain trading post. Mrs. Callahan cried through the entire ceremony, insisting afterward that she'd never witnessed anything quite so fitting as watching two people who'd found each other through fraud and danger and fever finally properly commit themselves to a lifetime together. "Never seen a mountain man smile so much in all my years knowing him," she told Eleanor at the small gathering following the ceremony, watching Caleb across the yard, laughing at something one of the homesteaders had said. An easy warmth in his expression that Eleanor herself had helped coax back into existence after years of guarded solitude. "He deserves every bit of happiness he's finding," Eleanor said, watching him with the same fond warmth. "After everything he lost, after everything he survived alone up on that mountain." "So do you, dear," Mrs. Callahan said gently. "Never forget that. You deserve this happiness every bit as much as he does. Eleanor thought of Hargrove's cruel words that first terrible day. I expected a wife, not a burden, and felt them finally completely lose whatever power they'd once held over her. She was not a burden. She never had been. She was simply a woman who'd needed the right person to recognize her worth, and she'd found him in the most unexpected of places, on a mountain trail she'd never intended to walk, in a cabin she'd never expected to call home. The months that followed brought a steady, contented rhythm to their life together. The cabin transformed from a lonely man's fortress into something warm and thriving. Eleanor's garden, planted that first spring of their marriage, grew steadily beside the cabin, providing vegetables that supplemented their winter stores, considerably better than Caleb's meager bachelor provisions ever had. The ledger she'd first transformed from chaos into order became the foundation of a modest but growing business as word spread through the territory of her skill with numbers, homesteaders and small business owners alike, seeking her help untangling their own confused accounts. She never forgot the women who'd laughed at her that first terrible day, though she found with time that the memory no longer carried the same sharp sting it once had. Instead, it had become something closer to a marker, the precise moment her old life had ended, and her true one had begun, however painful the transition had first appeared. It was nearly a year after that first terrible day at Pruitt's trading post that Eleanor found herself standing on the same porch watching a new stagecoach arrive, carrying with it another woman clutching a small trunk and an expression of anxious hope that Eleanor recognized instantly, painfully, as her own reflection from 12 months before. The woman stepped down carefully, scanning the gathered crowd for a face she clearly hoped would greet her warmly, and Eleanor watched her heart sink as no such welcome materialized the crowd's attention. Instead, settling into the same curious, faintly judgmental appraisal Eleanor herself had once endured. She didn't hesitate. "Ma'am," Eleanor said, stepping forward with a warmth she wished someone had offered her that first terrible day. "Welcome to Blackridge. I'm Eleanor Morgan. Is there someone meeting you here today?" The woman's eyes, wide and uncertain, found Eleanor's with visible relief at the unexpected kindness. "I'm not entirely certain," she admitted. "I've come to marry a rancher named Thomas Reeves, but I don't see anyone matching his description among the crowd." Eleanor felt an unwelcome twist of familiar dread, recognizing in the stranger's anxious hope the exact vulnerability she herself had once carried, utterly unprotected against whatever disappointment might be waiting. "Well," Eleanor said, offering her hand with a warmth that came easily, now hard-won through everything she'd survived. "Whatever happens with Mr. Reeves, you're not standing here alone. I promise you that." The woman's shoulders eased slightly, some of the anxious tension draining from her posture at Eleanor's simple, steady kindness, and Eleanor found herself thinking as she guided the stranger toward Pruitt's counter to inquire after Reeves's whereabouts, of everything that had changed since that terrible day when she herself had knelt in frozen mud gathering scattered belongings while an entire town watched and laughed. She had come west believing herself destined for quiet domestic obligation, humiliated instead by a man too calculating to recognize her worth. She had found in the wreckage of that rejection something she never could have imagined. Not just love, though the love she'd found with Caleb remained the truest gift of her entire life, but purpose and community, and the particular hard-won understanding that her value had never depended on anyone else's approval at all. Thomas Reeves arrived 20 minutes later, and though his greeting proved considerably warmer than Hargrove's cruel rejection had been, Eleanor watched from a respectful distance, satisfied to see the stranger's anxious expression finally soften into genuine relief and cautious happiness. Caleb found her still standing near the trading post steps when he arrived from checking on a neighboring homestead, his expression curious at finding her there. "Everything all right?" he asked, dismounting beside her. "Everything's fine," Eleanor said, leaning into the familiar comfort of his presence. "Just watching another stagecoach arrive. Thought for a moment it might be someone who needed the same kindness I once needed myself." Caleb studied her for a long moment, understanding passing between them, without need for further explanation. "You've got a good heart, Eleanor Morgan. Always looking out for the ones the world's too quick to overlook." "Someone taught me that lesson," Eleanor said, smiling up at him. "Rather effectively, if I recall correctly." "Reckon I did." Caleb agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Best decision I ever made, offering shelter to a stranger the whole town had already decided wasn't worth the trouble. They rode back up the mountain together as evening settled soft and golden over the peaks, and Eleanor found herself thinking, as she often did during quiet moments like this. One of the particular improbable journey that had led her here, from humiliation to purpose, from rejection to belonging, from a stranger's cruel dismissal to a partnership built on genuine respect and hard-won love. The cabin that had once been a lonely man's fortress now stood as something far different. A home built through shared labor and mutual understanding, through fever-lit nights and blizzard-survived dangers, through the slow, steady work of two wounded people, learning to trust again after years of believing themselves unworthy of anything more than mere survival. Eleanor Morgan had arrived in this territory, believing herself a burden unwanted and unworthy, discarded by a man too shallow to recognize her value. She had found instead exactly what she'd traveled 2,000 miles, hoping to discover: not a husband who wanted her despite her size, her stubbornness, her sharp mind and sharper tongue, but a partner who wanted her entirely because of everything she was. The mountain that had once seemed so unforgiving now felt in every way that mattered like exactly where she was always meant to be. And as the cabin's familiar lights came into view against the darkening sky, smoke rising steady from a chimney that had once burned only for solitary survival and now burned for something infinitely warmer, Eleanor understood with complete and unshakable certainty that Josiah Hargrove's cruel rejection had never been the ending it once seemed. It had been all along the beginning of the only life she had ever truly wanted. A life built not on being chosen for what she could provide, but for exactly who she was. And that she had finally learned was more than enough.